Esher, Guardians of Hades Romance Series, Book 3. Written by Felicity Heaton. Narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 10. The sky had cleared by the time Esher stopped in front of a small gatehouse in the middle of a long white wall topped with traditional gray ribbed tiles, and scrubbed a hand around his neck, rubbing at the short hair at the back of his head. Aiko looked around at the street, including back the way they had come, towards the distant park, and then returned her gaze to him. Had he changed his mind and no longer wanted her to see the place he called home? It had to be close, because they had been walking a while, far longer than she had expected based on what he had told her. Did he live in one of the box-shaped two-story houses that were set away back from the white wall, giving the traditional building space and respect that it deserved? The houses around it were worn and basic, but he didn't need to be ashamed if he lived in one. They were as simple as her family's home and what most of the population of Japan lived in now. For an agonizing moment, she thought he might insist on taking her home instead. But then he heaved a sigh that stretched his dark shirt tight across his chest, let his hand fall from his neck, and turned not towards the dull gray houses that were jammed close together, but towards the imposing wooden gate opposite them. She could only stare as he pushed the heavy gate open and looked back at her, something that resembled nerves or possibly fear in his eyes. If he thought she was going to say something negative about the fact he lived in a traditional house, or judge him for having such an expensive home, then he was mistaken. But damn, it was impressive as she stepped through the gate he held for her and came face to face with a sweeping mansion fit for an emperor. White-paneled walls supported the width of the gray-tiled roof, and dark aged wood enclosed the elegant entrance of the house in the center of the building. The grounds between her and the door had been lovingly manicured, with topiaries spotted around the gravel that bordered the entire front of the mansion, and continued around the sides to her left and right, and beautiful cherry trees and maples on the grassy areas in each corner. On either side of the path in front of her, ancient stone lanterns stood proud, almost as tall as she was, and to the left of the house a covered walkway linked it to another smaller building. Esher shifted foot to foot beside her, and she felt his unease ripple through her. She wasn't sure she had ever seen a home so beautiful, so perfect. She had stayed with her family at inns that had looked similar, but this place felt different, more serene, quieter, soothing. Esher drew his hand over his face, glanced at her, and then closed the gate and led the way towards the house. He kicked his boots off at the entrance one at a time and set them on the rack. It was strange to see him do such a thing, and her earlier comment about how he hadn't learned the traditions of her land came back to haunt her. He knew them and he respected them. She joined him on the porch, removing one shoe and placing her foot on the wooden deck before stooping to remove her other one. When she handed them to him, he set them down next to his and stared at them, a glimmer of conflict in his eyes that disappeared when he blinked. He opened the door for her. Aiko followed him inside and stopped dead as the size of it hit her. It was enormous. The room spanned almost the entire length of the house, with a long polished traditional wooden dining table occupying most of the mats to her left, and a strangely out-of-place and modern group of couches and armchairs set up to her right, facing a huge flat-screen TV. Esher kept moving forwards, and she peered into the room beyond the dining table. A kitchen. Walls had been built around it, separating it from a wooden walkway that led to the smaller building she had seen outside. That walkway branched to the right, too, past paper-paneled rooms that were closed off. When light flooded the room, she looked at Esher, and her breath left her in a rush. He stood on a covered walkway beyond the panels he had opened, staring out into a garden that had her reevaluating her use of the words serene and beautiful for the exterior garden she had passed through to reach the house. This was beautiful. She moved forwards, her feet carrying her towards the elegant formal garden enclosed by the three sides of the house, filled with pale gravel and perfectly positioned topiary and mossy boulders. It turned to grass near a broad rippling pond that flowed beneath the wing of the house to her right, and a traditional red wooden bridge crossed it at a narrow point, leading her eye to the huge cherry trees in full bloom on the other side, where the garden undulated in a more informal series of hills and valleys. Esher looked over his shoulder at her as she reached him. She could feel him waiting to hear her opinion and whether she liked it. "It's stunning," she breathed, a little lost in traversing it with her eyes, fascinated by finding things she had missed at first glance, hidden paths and lanterns, and a seemingly ever-changing vista as the sun moved, sinking lower. "How did you come to live here?" He shrugged, but it was stiff. "Father bought it, and it's been in the family ever since." He didn't want her to ask more, but she wanted to know. Couldn't see such an impressive house without needing to know more about it and the man who lived in it. "You live here with only your brother?" She hoped he didn't find that question too intrusive. When he almost smiled, she relaxed a little. "I do, but I have other brothers." He turned away, heading back into the house, and as much as she didn't want to leave the garden, could spend forever looking at it and never grow tired, she wanted to know more about Esher. She found him in the kitchen, rifling through a large modern refrigerator. "How many brothers do you have?" His voice came from the other side of the silver door. 2 older and 4 younger. 6 brothers. She couldn't imagine what it was like to have such a large family, but she felt a little envious as she tried. "Are they all like you?" She moved to the other side of the kitchen so she could see him and rested against one of the wooden cabinets. He poked his head out of the refrigerator, his handsome face etched in thoughtful lines, and frowned as he closed the door and set some vegetables down on the work surface. "We're all quite different, really. Like fire and ice. Some more so than others." He hadn't quite understood her question, but she didn't correct him as he set to work. She had meant were they all spirits, or possibly gods? But he answered that question in a way, revealing one thing to her. They were all elementals. She took up a knife and a chopping block and moved to stand beside him at the cramped workspace. He didn't stop her when she took the carrots from him and started peeling them. He just stared. When he had been staring at her for so long, she started to feel self-conscious. She paused and glanced up at him. "Sorry. I just always do the cooking. The only time I get help, it's under duress. My brothers are lazy." He picked up an onion and peeled it. "They prefer to sit in the other room waiting for me to prepare the meal." He didn't seem bothered by that. She leaned back, looked through to the other room, and then went back to chopping carrots. "I'd rather help." She had the feeling that pleased him as he started cutting up the onion, and followed it with a few potatoes and then some beef. When she was done with her carrots, she set them aside and looked around at the small kitchen. 3 rice cookers sat side by side on the counter opposite. Big appetites? She supposed 7 men would eat a lot of food. While Esher finished up with the ingredients, she hunted through the cupboards for the rice and got it on for him. "I was going to do that," he said as he took a large pot from one of the bottom cupboards and set it on the stove, and the note in his deep voice told her that this time he wasn't happy. Because he wanted to impress her with his cooking? She hadn't missed the pride that had shone in his eyes when he had announced that he was a competent cook. "I can't find the sauce packet." She closed the final cupboard and looked over her shoulder at him. He stared at her, blue eyes wide, a flicker of confusion in them. "Sauce packet?" "For the curry." She presumed they were cooking curry rice anyway. He chuckled and shook his head. "Sauce packet." Aiko could only watch as he opened a cupboard above the stove and pulled out an armful of different glass jars and metal pots, and proceeded to open them, measuring different herbs and spices out onto a plate. So maybe he was a better cook than her, because she always used store-bought sauce for her curry. In fact, she had never cooked it from scratch before, and was sure she had never known anyone who did either. When the curry was bubbling on the stove and smelling mouth-wateringly delicious, she took some plates and bowls and set the table for him, picking the end nearest the door, where she had a view into the garden. It was growing close to sunset now, and the garden was even more breathtaking as the light turned golden and warm. She hadn't realized she had paused to soak it in until Esher appeared in front of her, a pot of curry in his hands. She smiled at him, helped him arrange the heavy pot on a stand, and filled a glass with water for him as he went back into the kitchen, returning with the rice. He chose the seat that had its back to the garden, and she knew he had done it on purpose, giving her the view. "Thank you." She took the plate he offered to her, and the tempting smell of curry filled her nostrils, making her stomach grumble. He filled his own plate and set it down, and as she gathered a spoonful of both rice and curry, he stared at her, waiting again. She popped it into her mouth, and her eyes widened as her taste buds lit up. She covered her mouth. "Oh, she!" "Delicious." Esher smiled, the sight of it almost as delicious as his cooking. "You look like an anime character." She shook her head. "I'm being serious. You're a good cook." He averted his gaze and muttered, "I've had a lot of time to practice." Aiko studied him as he fell silent again, enjoying her food and the time with him. She wasn't sure how long spirits or gods lived, whether they were truly immortal or only lived longer lives than humans. He looked no more than 8 years her senior, but he could be thousands of years old. Her mother had married her father, and there was a 15-year age difference between them, and her grandmother had been almost 20 years younger than her grandfather. She wouldn't care if there was an 8-year or 8,000-year age gap between her and Esher. She felt connected to him, deeply. He glanced at her as he ate, and she had the feeling he wanted to speak but was struggling to settle on a topic. "You'll have to share the recipe with me." She pushed her empty plate aside and smiled for him, hoping it would soothe him and help him find his voice. "You can fight me for it." The twinkle in his clear blue eyes said he wasn't being serious, and it was strange to see this side of him when he had only ever been deadly serious around her. His expression shifted as that thought drifted through her mind, turning awkward again. That conflict reigniting in his eyes as he grabbed the plates, rose to his feet in one fluid motion and walked into the kitchen. Why did he find it so hard to be relaxed around her? Why did he find it so difficult to trust someone? She could feel trust was the source of his conflict, stirred feelings in him that he didn't like, or wasn't sure how to cope with them. Was it because he was a spirit or god and she was human, and he wasn't used to talking with her kind? She had encountered spirits at a shrine in the mountains once, and they had turned vicious when she had tried to communicate with them, chasing her from the sacred grounds. They had manifested enough to throw barbs at her, callous words that had cut her because they had been the first spirits she had encountered, that had been violent towards her, and a foolish part of her had started to believe all spirits were kind and gentle, and enjoyed sharing their world with humans. Aiko's gaze tracked Esher as he walked back to the table, and as he cleared the other dishes, following him back and forth between the kitchen. He was troubled again. She switched her focus to the garden and the outside world when he disappeared into the kitchen for the final time, and she wasn't surprised to see clouds threading the horizon. It was going to rain again if she didn't do something, and as much as she enjoyed the rain, she couldn't find it soothing or peaceful when she knew it stemmed from his turmoil. When he stopped by the table again, she looked up at him and smiled as she found a subject he could talk with her about, one that was bound to take his mind off his troubles. "Will you show me around? The house is beautiful, but I would love to see the grounds too." She was the one who waited this time, a little anxious to hear his answer, heart filled with hope that he would consent to it and wasn't about to mention taking her home. She didn't want to go home. Not yet. Home was quiet, cold, and here she felt warm, with Esher. He tunneled his fingers through his wild black hair, shoving the long lengths away from his eyes, and looked between her and the garden. His chest heaved with a deep sigh, and her hope faltered, cold already settling into her bones again as her fear that he was going to take her home caught hold of her. When he finally spoke, heat washed that cold away. "All right." She pushed onto her feet and joined him when he jerked his chin towards the other end of the room. "You've already seen the kitchen." He led her across the tatami mats to the couches that surrounded the wooden coffee table and television. "My brothers voted for this. I was against it at first, but now I think I spend half my time here watching the news and documentaries. Shows about real life, not fantasy. He preferred to experience the world in this way? Or perhaps he merely wanted to know more about the one outside of Tokyo. She wasn't sure whether he was bound by anything. Many spirits and gods were, forced to remain in one location, starved of information about the outside world. She had told a few about current events, and sometimes talked to herself when she visited shrines, just in case any spirits and gods in the vicinity were interested. She pointed to a long, low side cupboard set against the far wall, beyond the cream furniture. You have movies, too." It was stacked full of DVDs and games, too. He hiked his shoulders. "I watch them sometimes, mostly when my brothers are visiting." "And you watch anime?" When he looked at her, she added, "You said I was like an anime character, so I guessed you watched it." He ran his blue eyes over her, quickly at first, but they slowed as he took her in, making her feel self-conscious again as he lingered on her ruffled black skirt and then her legs. "You look like one," he muttered, voice low and rough, and heat flared in his eyes, banked but burning, igniting her own desire as she stood and let him look at her, didn't hide from him as she normally would from a man. She liked the feel of his eyes on her, the way he looked at her as if he wanted to devour her, or possess her, as if she was special, precious. "You look like a J-rock star." She held back her smile when he frowned at her. "Your hair, the way you tuck the bottoms of your jeans into your boots, even the scarf you like to wear." He scowled now, but there was no real anger behind it. "I like it." She twirled away from him, felt his gaze boring into her as she headed towards the corridor, and found him staring at her, that heat breaking through in his eyes, as she spun to face him again. Heat that said he liked the way she dressed, too. "What's this way?" She had never been so forward in someone's home before, knew it was rude to take the lead rather than wait to be shown, but she felt relaxed in the ancient house with him. At home. He trailed after her, fire still burning in his eyes. They were brighter now, the blue turning tropical as he hit the wooden walkway with her. He gestured to the rooms to his right and her left as she walked backwards in front of him. "Each of my brothers has a room here. I should probably keep you out of them. Both wings are just our bedrooms." She spun away from him and pointed to the far end of the wing. "And yours is above the pond." He stopped walking. His voice was a low growl. "How did you know?" Aiko looked over her shoulder at him. Surprise danced in his eyes, but a ripple of darkness marred it, turned his handsome face too serious for her liking, and had a warning arrowing through her that told her to say something to soothe him. She turned and took a step back towards him. "It was a guess." Sort of. She had figured that a water god would like to sleep close to his element. His irises darkened, turning inky as his black eyebrows dipped low above them. "A guess?" She didn't like the bite in his tone, or the way it sounded like an accusation. She nodded and forced herself to take a step towards him rather than away. He wasn't a danger to her. The way he eyed her said he might be, his expression savage and irises dark as he studied her, as if he was trying to see through her to the truth, and wasn't going to be happy if he discovered it was as dire as he was imagining. "It was just a guess." She spoke softly, held her hands up between them, and edged towards him. His eyes turned stormy and clouds rapidly multiplied overhead. The scent of rain laced the thick air. "You weren't spying on me?" he snarled, and she might have laughed and thought he was teasing if he hadn't looked so serious. She shook her head. "No. I saw the way you looked at the lake at the tea house, and the way you were looking at the pond after you had opened the doors when we arrived here. And I thought you would like the room that was set over the water." The truth. As much as she would tell him, because she wasn't sure how he would react if she mentioned that she could tell he wasn't human like her. His accusation rang warning bells in her mind that said he would react badly right now. He thought she had been spying on him, because he was finding it hard to trust her. He was looking for a reason not to, and telling him that she knew he was different to her was a surefire way of making him believe he couldn't trust her, that she was out to harm him or do something terrible to him. He would think everything they had been through, everything they had shared, had been a lie to manipulate him into letting her get closer to him. He wouldn't understand that she didn't care he was a god or a spirit, or whatever he was. He wouldn't understand that she just enjoyed his company and felt a connection to him, felt attracted to him. "I need to do something. Look around the garden." His voice darkened in time with his handsome face as he took a hard step towards her. "Do not venture too far or open any of the rooms." She nodded, and he pivoted on his heel and stalked away from her, heading back towards the main room of the house. She remained rooted to the walkway, her pulse pounding as she tried to let his change in demeanor roll off her back and not let it cut her. Maybe she had been right about him, and he was both benevolent and violent. He moved past the open doors in the center of the building, his head bent, gaze locked onto the smartphone in his right hand. He was calling someone? About her? She hadn't done anything wrong, but she had the feeling he thought she had, that he honestly believed she had been spying on him for some nefarious reason, or was out to hurt him. When he disappeared down the corridor that led to the other smaller building and didn't reappear, she blew out her breath and looked around her at the beautiful mansion. His snarled words echoed in her head, warning her not to open any of the rooms, or venture too far. He wanted to know where she was at all times. Didn't he trust her? After what they had shared, that stung. But what hurt her most of all was the feeling that she had been a fool, stupid for believing what they had shared had meant something to him, crazy for thinking it was going to become something, and an idiot for trusting him. He wasn't a man, but he certainly acted just like one. Chapter 11. Esher had lost track of Aiko at some point during his tense texted conversation with Mark that had resulted in his brother telling him at least a dozen times that a demon couldn't breach the wards that protected the mansion. Unsatisfied with that answer, Esher had asked whether one of them could bring a demon into the grounds. As far as Mark knew, they would have to mark a demon with a specific set of counter wards in order to bring them past the walls. And as far as Esher knew, Aiko didn't have any such wards on her. And since only he and his brothers and his father knew which wards had been used in protecting the mansion, a demon couldn't mark themselves with the counter wards anyway. It should have set his mind at ease, but now he couldn't find her. And worse, Mark had mentioned telling their brothers and sending some backup because he was sounding jumpy. Esher had sent a 2-word response to that. Fuck off. He had then focused his power to reach his brother halfway around the world in a remote area near Seville and made it rain just on his villa. Mark had got the message loud and clear and had sent a text back saying he wouldn't tell a soul, but only if Esher stopped bringing a biblical flood down on his home. Esher had flipped the switch on it and had gone in search of Aiko, expecting to find her where he had left her, only she hadn't been there. Something had flipped inside him on seeing that. Something that had birthed a fierce, almost desperate need to find her, to know that she was still near to him, that she hadn't walked out of the mansion grounds, away from him. Gods. Fucking gods, he needed to find her. Her fucking shoes had been gone from the front porch, a sight that had stabbed him in the gut and left him bleeding worse than any blade. But she couldn't be gone. Could she? His own words haunted him, an accusation that sounded like a royal dick move now that he was looking back at it. But at the time, the dark side of himself had been at the helm, had bellowed at him that she knew which room was his because she had been sent to harm him. She was the demon due to attack him. He felt like a fucking idiot for latching on to that and running with it. She wasn't a demon. If she had been one, she would have made his gut swirl, and he would have smelled it on her, the unmistakable coppery stench of a demon giving her away. She was just a human, one who had trusted him, had taken a leap today that had been as monumental as the one he had taken too. Only he had ruined it by taking another leap afterwards, this one a massive leap to a conclusion that left him feeling guilty as hell. He stormed over the red wooden bridge that curved above the pond and followed the path on the other side, his boots loud on the gravel. She had to be in the garden. That was the reason her shoes were missing. She couldn't have left him. He didn't want her to be gone. But fuck, he could understand if she was. He had to deal with his special brand of crazy on a daily basis and found it annoying enough. She had done nothing to deserve being hit with it. His throat tightened, lungs squeezing as his heart labored, and the need to find her grew more desperate with each passing second. Every minute that ticked past and left him empty-handed, alone. Beyond the wall, the sky burned in shades of pink and orange, fingers of clouds caressing the sunset and blazing gold. It was beautiful, but he felt nothing as he looked at it, frantic with a need to find Aiko. He chuckled mirthlessly at that. When had he become so desperate to be with a human? He despised them, wanted to destroy them, to make them suffer as they deserved. Had he made Aiko suffer? He stopped, eyes fixed on the setting sun, as that question chilled him to his marrow. Had he? He pushed trembling fingers through his hair, tugging it back from his face, and gritted his teeth as the answer assaulted him, an onslaught of feelings that left him shaking, weak. He had, and it killed him. And if she had left him, then fuck, he deserved it, because he didn't deserve her. He didn't deserve her light, her smiles, her laughter, or her sweet company. He deserved this coldness, this loneliness devouring his soul as he watched a sunset that could have been magical with her beside him, but instead felt colorless and dead to him. And gods, he didn't understand any of it. Not the way she had trusted him or how she had given a piece of herself to him, or the fact he wanted to spend time with her, craved her company as fiercely as he craved war with her kind. He still despised humans, still wanted them to suffer. He would never forgive them or trust them. He would never learn to love them again. But he would make an exception for her. He just hoped she would make an exception for him, too. He focused on the road outside her family's clinic, bringing it into his mind so he could teleport there to find her. Movement on the very edge of his vision had him letting go of the power building inside him, and a wave of emotion crashing over him that was so powerful it moved him. Had him trembling with relief and 1,000 other feelings, ones he didn't want to understand because he feared where this was leading him. "Aiko," he breathed, deep voice rough, scraping low over gravel. She turned her head towards him but didn't move from her perch on the smooth gray boulder beneath the huge blooming tree, looking like some sort of fairy as she sat with her knees tucked up to her chest, enfolded in her arms, and cherry blossoms spiraling down around her like snow to land on her bare skin and lace her hair. Her dark eyes drifted away from him, down to her knees, and it was a gut punch that he deserved. "I'm sorry," he murmured, and followed the twisting path to her, sank to his knees on the grass beside the boulder and looked up at her. She refused to look at him, and his frustration got the better of him, had him rising on his knees to frame her face with his hands and make her look at him. "Was I wrong to trust you?" she whispered, each word cleaving his chest open a little more. He slowly shook his head. "No, but I was wrong not to trust you. I've been burned before. It makes it hard for me to explain, for one thing. He never talked about what had happened to him, not even to his brothers or his parents. He had bottled it up inside him, his burden to bear. But now there was a piece of him that wanted to share that burden, all in the hope it would lift some of the weight from his shoulders, and it shook him that he wanted to do it with her, a human. She awed him by lifting her hands and placing them over his on her face, her touch gentle and soft, so far from what he deserved after how he had treated her. "I thought you had gone." He couldn't hold back those words, and couldn't hide the pain that thought had caused him as she gazed down into his eyes. She canted her head and moved her right hand to his cheek, her beautiful face soft with understanding and a touch of concern. "I found this tree, and it was so beautiful in the sunset that I wanted to enjoy it. The blossoms are so fleeting." Like human life. He felt the gravity of that as he looked at her. They were weak, breakable, vulnerable. The slightest thing killed them. Images of her caught up in all the ways she could die, everything from something as simple as an accident to a disease, rampaged through his mind, provoking his darker, more possessive nature, rousing it until he was restless with a need to hold her, to shield her from the world and keep her safe from it, safe with him. "Esher," she said softly, her fingers brushing his cheek, playing on the crest of his cheekbone and down to the hollow, and then to his jaw, her eyes locked on his, holding him immobile as the warmth and comfort they held crashed over him. "The sunset is so beautiful." "Don't spoil it." He felt those words in hers, as clearly as he could feel the clouds building above him, born of a desperate need to control something which he knew he had no command over. He was a god, but not a god-king. Only Zeus had power over life and death, and his father. The ground trembled, a warning from his father that he knew the course of his thoughts. Beneath his knees, flowers bloomed, blue Himalayan poppies sprouting up around him. His mother, He got her message loud and clear. Ignore his father. It also made him realize something. She was aware of Aiko, of the change in his temperament the little human had caused. Both of his parents were. Which meant Hades had to be aware that he was at the mercy of the blood he had given him, and that now that his need of Aiko had been roused, he would move all the realms to keep her at his side. He breathed through his pain, pushed out the terrible thoughts clouding his mind, and focused on his little butterfly as she shifted on the rock to face him, setting her feet down on either side of his knees. Poppies bloomed around them, too, tried to entwine with her shoelaces and creep up her leg, but she didn't notice. "You never finished our tour." Aiko's gentle voice drew him back to her, helped the clouds scatter and let light flood back into his heart. He pushed onto his feet, hesitated only a moment before taking hold of her hand, and led her towards the nearest wing of the house, away from his room. She was silent as she walked beside him on the narrow path that wound between mossy boulders, blooming azaleas, and under trees. The one she had been admiring was one of the wards, a tree that had been in that spot since before Hades had built the mansion. His father had constructed the walls around 2 more trees of similar age, using their strong connection to the earth to strengthen the wards he had then placed on them. Aiko's gaze leaped to him as he led her across a series of stepping stones set into the gravel that surrounded the house. When she stopped near the broad stone step beside the raised wooden walkway, he stooped and removed her shoes for her, helping her up onto the step. She waited as he removed his boots, and he placed them down at the corner of the walkway near the courtyard. She went to walk that way. He caught her wrist and tugged her in the opposite direction. "You've seen the courtyard." Her eyes grew a little wider. "There's more?" Understanding dawned in her gaze. "The smaller building. I saw it from outside, and I wondered what it was for." He hadn't intended to take her there, but the thought of leading her to that place, of stripping her bare and bathing with her in the huge stone pool, had him wondering whether she would consent to such a thing. There was still a little sunset left. She led the way again, and he wondered if he would always follow her, trailing behind her so he could watch her, could see every fascinated glance she gave to the world, every smile that reached her eyes and lit up her face. When she rounded the corner, she stopped so abruptly he almost collided with her. The walkway continued down this side of the wing, joining with the wooden open structure at the far end, and the white wall opposite to enclose one of his favorite spaces in the house. "You have a Zen garden." Her chocolate eyes leaped to his, the surprise in them matching that in her voice, and he wanted to smile at her. Her gaze traced the swirling lines of gravel that swept around cragged rocks and always made him think of tides, flowing endlessly, unstoppable. Beautiful. He did smile when she shot him an incredulous look. "Who looks after it?" "Me. Who else?" He caught hold of her wrist again and risked a look back at her as he led her towards the bathhouse. "You wanted to know what was in the smaller building." She leaned to one side and glanced past him, towards it, a flicker of nerves emerging in her eyes as they landed on the building, with its thick wooden columns that supported the tiled roof, allowing the front to remain open to the elements. Together with the huge bath. It poked out from beneath the cover, half in and half out of it, so someone could laze in it and see the whole of the sky if they wanted it. Steam curled from the surface of the water, kept at a perfect temperature by the thermal spring below the house that they drew it from, rich with minerals that made a good soak absolute heaven. When they reached the bath, Aiko crouched and brushed her hand through the water. "You must have been in plenty of hot springs before." He stilled when she looked up at him, the pretty blush on her cheeks telling him that she might have, but she had never been in any of the mixed ones. He wasn't sure when he had implied they were going to bathe together, but now it was in his head. It was all he could think about. His eyes leaped between hers, a need to see what she was thinking tugging at him, making him restless. Did she want to bathe with him? Did he want to bathe with her? Really want it? It wasn't the thought of being naked around her that had his nerves rising. It was the fact that if he stripped off, she would see the extent of his scars. He wasn't sure how he would react if she pressed him about them. She had mentioned them before, and thinking about how he had gotten them had stirred his darker nature, and he had come close to ruining the moment. He wanted to press her to promise not to ask, but it would only make her more curious, more liable to stare at them. I could just take you home. He could also just cut his wrists and let himself bleed out right now. Taking her home would have the same effect. He felt sure he might die without her. She shyly shook her head, stealing a little piece of his black heart. I'm not going to try anything. We'll keep our underwear on. He sounded like a damned virgin again, all jittery and awkward. She nodded again, but remained where she was, staring at the water, and he wasn't sure whether she wanted to bathe with him or bolt for the hills. Either way, she clearly needed a moment to overcome her nerves, and so did he. So he took himself off to the washing area and stripped off his shirt and t-shirt, and then his jeans and socks. When her eyes landed on him, burning into him, following his every move, it was damned hard to focus on washing himself with the soap and water. She finally moved, taking measured steps toward him that screamed of nerves, but each one was more confident than the last, as if she was defeating her fear. And by the time she reached him, she looked as courageous as she had in the moment before she had kissed him. Gods, he wanted to kiss her again. He handed her the water scoop and cloth and made a fast exit instead, his nerves getting the better of him. Her gaze scalded his back, making his muscles tense in response as he waited for her to say something about the scars. She turned away instead. He released the breath he had been holding, stepped down into the hot water, and held back the groan as he sank into it, the heat of it instantly melting his tension away. It was hard to keep his focus off her as she moved around behind him, hard to shut out the images of her stripping off, and the ones of her washing herself as water sloshed around. Esher grabbed one of the white cloths from the side of the tub, soaked it, and placed it over his face as he groaned, his cock as hard as stone in his trunks and demanding attention. Her attention. This had been a bad idea, made all the worse by the images popping into his head, visions of his brothers appearing while Aiko was half naked in the water with him. He growled under his breath, pushed the cloth up onto his hair, and glanced over his shoulder to make sure she wasn't paying any attention to him, and held his hand out. His mobile phone shot into it, his powers proving themselves more than handy once again, and he fired off a group message to his brothers. In a bad mood. Steer clear of Tokyo. I need a quiet night in. Hopefully that wouldn't raise too many questions or concerns, as it wasn't the first or 1,000th time he had sent a similar message. But for good measure, he made it rain in every city his brothers protected as he tossed his phone on the deck beside him. The sky above Tokyo remained beautifully clear, though. He started when Aiko's foot appeared close to him, a delicate thing that was a work of art. One he found himself scanning for even a sign of a ward. Fucking arsehole. She wasn't a demon. She wasn't out to hurt him. She trusted him, and he could trust her. She dipped into the water so it washed over her shoulders and made the ends of her black hair wet, and then sighed as she drifted away from him on her back, her pink satin panties and bra a shade darker than before. This is heaven. She loosed another low sigh of satisfaction. It certainly was. He couldn't take his eyes off her as she floated on the water. It was a struggle to keep his thoughts off the fact she was in his element. Water he had command over, and it was all over her. In private places he wanted to explore. He gritted his teeth and kicked that urge out of his head. He was not about to turn a perfectly nice bath into a scene out of some hentai anime involving a man manipulating water to be intimate with a woman. Not his scene. Still, he was a little jealous that the water was getting to enjoy her more than he was, so he coaxed it a touch, just enough to make her float in his direction. She frowned when she turned and started drifting towards him, and rolled onto her front, wrecking his attempt to casually get her closer to him. He offered her a scrap of cloth. She shook her head. I never get dizzy from hot springs. Not a bad thing, because if she got all faint and woozy, he would probably lose his shit when worrying about her. She smiled at him, another high-beam one meant to devastate, and he frowned and reached for her, wanting her closer. She placed her hand in his, and the moment her fingers closed over his palm, he gripped her and pulled her towards him. She shrieked, water spraying everywhere as she surged towards him, and giggled as her free hand planted against his bare chest to stop her from slamming into him. Her laughter died as her eyes met his. "You're missing the sunset," he husked. She moved a little closer, her palm shifting to the spot over his heart, and her eyes fell to his mouth. "I'll catch the next one," she murmured. "I like this view better." And then her lips were on his. Chapter 12. Esher flipped the last pancake out onto the plate, put it on the tray with a glass of juice and the maple syrup, and switched off the stove. Breakfast was served, although it was almost evening now. Gods, he grinned at that. After a long, lazy make-out session in the bath that had stopped at kissing, which had been more than enough for him because he couldn't get enough of kissing her, he had spent the whole night talking to Aiko, telling her small things about himself and listening to her talk about her family, about her studies, and then just lazing with her on the walkway in front of the entrance to the courtyard garden, watching the moon as it rose, savoring the fuck out of the moment. He still wasn't sure how it had happened, how he had gone from wanting every mortal on the face of the earth dead at his feet to needing one of them with a ferocity that shook him and left him feeling off balance. When the sun had broken the horizon and he had realized Aiko had fallen asleep resting against him, he had scooped her up and carried her into his room, set her down on his bedding and covered her. He even tucked her in. Part of him had been tempted to stay with her, watching over her, breathing her in as he stole every second with her. In the end, he had convinced himself to go and let her rest, not wanting to disturb her. Now the sun was close to setting again. She was bound to wake soon, and he wanted to surprise her with breakfast. He lifted the tray and carried it through the main room, towards the walkway to his left that would bring him to his room, and Aiko. The thought of seeing her smile at him when she woke to find him waiting with breakfast made the corners of his lips curve into a semblance of a smile. It dropped off his face at the same time as the tray dropped from his hands, when he spotted someone standing on the walkway outside his room, reaching for the panel to slide it open. As the plate and glass smashed on impact, he launched himself at the male, closing his hand around his throat as a black need to protect Aiko blasted through him. He hauled Diamond off his feet, twisted, and came damned close to throwing him across the garden and starting a fight. But his fucking hand froze up, ice covering it, sticking it to his brother's inky roll-neck sweater. "I told you about doing that," Diamond growled, his eyes glowing almost white in the fading light, and Esher noticed the hand his brother had locked around his wrist. He marched Diamond towards the main room of the house, because if he couldn't throw the bastard for coming close to intruding on Aiko, he could at least make sure his brother kept his distance from her. "And I told you all about wearing shoes in the house." His hand burned, the cold searing him as viciously as any fire could have, but he didn't release his brother until he was as far from Aiko as possible. He set Diamond down on the mat near the front door and grimaced as he moved his fingers, cracking the ice covering them. Diamond let him go, making the whole process easier but no less painful. "You all right?" "You startled me. You did get the text I sent?" He checked his hand over as warmth returned to it, relieved to find no permanent damage. His element allowed him to withstand Diamond's ice a little, enough that he didn't get frostbite as easily as most of his brothers if Diamond touched him. But handling Diamond for an extended period of time was dangerous and liable to end with him losing his hand. He didn't want to have to grow a new one. Everyone left that sort of shit to Valen, who had tested the extent of their regenerative abilities once. It had been disgusting watching his hand grow back. He glanced towards the corridor that led to his room, at the broken glass and china scattered across the wooden walkway, and the ruined breakfast, and wanted to beat his brother to a bloody pulp for it. "I did." Diamond rubbed at his throat, bent and tugged off his boots, setting them down at the door on a black mat Esher had been forced to add when his brothers had all started forgetting they were meant to take their damned boots off. "But something is moving. It hit New York and swept through Seville. We think it's coming this way." Fuck. He scrubbed a hand over his mouth, feeling sick to his stomach as his mind leaped forwards and filled in the blanks. "You think it might be?" Esher really didn't want to think about the fact a strong demon was due to attack him. He had forgotten all about it, had lost himself in Aiko, and it had been bliss, but letting himself get caught up in her and forgetting his duties, forgetting the enemy that was heading his way, was something he couldn't let happen again. He had a duty, and he was damned well going to fulfill it. He crossed the room to the kitchen, grabbed a glass, filled it with water, and practically inhaled it, needing it to calm his nerves as thoughts of the demon coming his way brought memories of the wraith on their heels, shaking him. He was stronger now, and he wouldn't let the bastard get the jump on him again, or the bitch who was targeting him. He wouldn't. He lowered the glass and stared at it. You ever wish we could drink something stronger? Diamond's silver-white eyebrows knitted hard above now ice-blue eyes. It's best we don't. The whole thing with Valen made it clear that it's too dangerous. What thing? Valen appeared, thankfully not in his usual flash of lightning, because the house was made of wood and Aiko was sleeping, and if either of those two things came to harm or were upset in any way, he might just douse his brother. Your booze habit, Esher bit out with a cold smile, and Valen towed off his boots before he could say anything. His brother's face darkened, the scar tissue down the left side of his jaw and neck pulling tight as he flashed teeth at Esher. Piss off. One drink. Valen flipped him off as if to emphasize the single drink with a single digit. And you destroyed a nightclub. Diamond eased past him, careful not to touch him. While Esher and Ares could withstand a little of Diamond's ice because of their element, Valen would be in danger of hypothermia or worse. Valen turned to track Diamond as he grinned and pushed his blonde hair from his eyes. You didn't see what happened before that. Esher couldn't hide his interest as he followed his two brothers towards the couches. What happened before? Valen sidled closer, his voice a low purr as he wriggled his fair eyebrows. Black box dirty dancing, nasty and rated XXX adult for my pleasure. Diamond caught the intrigue that must have been written across Esher's face, because he scowled at Valen and then at him. It didn't stop Esher from saying, So it was good for a while. Ares' hand slapped down on his shoulder as he appeared behind him, nearly crushing him with a combination of strength and searing heat that licked along his bones. Little brother, I'll hand you your arse if you so much as sniff alcohol. He frowned at the smoldering patch on his gray t-shirt when Ares released him and moved away. It was just a question. At least Ares had had the decency to take his footwear off before entering the house. Karis and Cal appeared next, his oldest brother looking as if he had gone 10 rounds with a gorgon. Waiting for their enemy to reappear was taking its toll on him too, but it wasn't like Karis to show it. Normally his brother appeared immaculate no matter what, but his black shirt had creases and he looked as if he needed another 20 hours sleep before the dark circles beneath his eyes went away and the dullness left his green irises. Marek shot Karis a concerned glance as he appeared. Thanks for the help. Karis shrugged it off, yawned, and drew his hand down his face. They were stronger than anticipated. What happened? Esher hated being out of the loop. His brothers had been in danger, and he should have been helping them, not sitting idle in Tokyo, because he had sent a message warning his brothers away. He had lied to them to keep them away so he could be alone with Aiko, and they had needed him but hadn't called on him, had all been involved in a fight against strong foes, and had left him on the bench because he had asked them to give him some space. The gods only knew how he would have been able to live with himself if they had been hurt. Is it the moon playing on you? Karis said, a wealth of concern in his tired green eyes as he looked across the group to Esher. Esher's heart felt as if someone had poured lead into it as he thought about that. It's 2 days until a full moon, and it's closer than normal. Not a perigee, but close. Everyone exchanged glances, ones that had the guilt churning in the pit of his stomach, growing more turbulent as he considered what that meant. He wouldn't be able to leave the mansion. He would have to remain within the barrier set out around the grounds, and someone would have to protect Tokyo in his place. He had risked venturing out during a previous full moon, and had ended up attacked by the Wraith because he had been distracted, so drawn to the moon that he had let his guard slip. When the moon was full and closer to the earth, it became harder to control his darker urges, and for the sake of the humans, he had to remain inside the mansion grounds, shielded by the wards. When the moon hit a perigee, well, he hated those days. They required more than just a few wards to keep him contained. "We can deal with the gate," Diamond offered, and Esher nodded, thankful for their help. "Even if something is coming this way, we'll find a way to keep the city safe." Because they couldn't risk letting him out. The female demon coming after him wanted him alive for some reason. He knew that much. Had heard Diamond and the others talking about it one night when he had surprised them by attending a meeting while he had still been recovering from the Wraith attack. "It'll be daylight in New York when it's dark here. I can handle it." Ares shot him a reassuring smile. "We missed Cal's birthday." Valen this time, and Esher knew what was coming next. "We should go out tonight. Come on, it'll be fun and we need to blow off some steam." "Didn't we just blow off steam?" Ares put in, his face set in his standard scowl. Cal grinned, his blue eyes bright with it. "I'm game." Kara sighed. "Must I remind everyone 2 gates were recently attacked by a powerful group of demons? It's not the time for fooling around." Marek hiked his wide shoulders. "There's no evidence to suggest the attacks are related to our true enemy. I've been monitoring gate and demon activity, and a few of the larger, older factions of demons are making plans, mobilizing forces, because they know we're being targeted. They want in on the action." "Or in through the gates," Ares grumbled, his expression blacker than Esher had seen it in a long time. He folded his arms across his chest, pulling his black t-shirt tight across his shoulders, and rubbed his thumb across his lower lip as his dark eyebrows dipped. "Demons would view this as a great chance to break through the gates and enter the underworld. We have our hands full waiting for whoever is behind the calamity, and dealing with them whenever they appear." That made a sickening sort of sense to Esher, and judging by the looks his other brothers exchanged, they felt the same way. And none of them were happy about it. This wasn't something they had anticipated. It was hard enough being on guard all the time, waiting for their enemy to attack them, without adding in other demon factions wanting to try their luck. Fuck, he could just imagine how his father would react if a group of demons were able to slip past them. He had banished them from the underworld for a reason, a damned good one. The wretches didn't deserve to live in a place ruled by a king they had revolted against and attempted to overthrow. "So we're not going out?" Cal looked disappointed, his eyes growing grayer as he frowned at them all and the tips of his blonde ponytail beginning to lift and flutter as if stirred by a breeze. Esher caught the look Karis gave him, one that silently screamed of how they couldn't risk letting him outside of the wards, just in case the attacks had been arranged by the Wraith and his cohorts. "Go. I'll stay here. It's fine." He didn't want to go out anyway. His brothers had disturbed his plans, and any moment now, Aiko was going to wake up. He wanted his brothers gone before that happened. Gods, he could just imagine the questions that would happen after he handed every single one of them their arses for just being in her presence. "I suppose I could take a break from research." Marek looked himself over, taking in his dirty dark linen trousers and torn shirt. "Although I might have to change, I can take a shower and grab some clothes from my room here." The thought of Marek showering when Aiko was in the house had Esher close to growling. Ares pulled a face. "I take it we can't bring the ladies." "Boys' night out." The dark edge to Cal's stormy blue eyes warned he was serious about that. "I want it to be like old times, just us guys, Esher included. I'm not accepting a no from you." Esher tensed when the thunder of tiny feet came from the corridor behind him, and all of his brothers looked there, several of them shifting into a fighting stance as the air thickened, anticipation rolling through it. Aiko squeaked as she skidded to a halt on the threshold of the room. He was quick to back towards her, and even quicker to growl when she pressed against his back, hiding there, and he reached around behind him to touch her. She was only wearing her underwear.
"I heard noises, and when I saw the broken plate—"
She burrowed deeper into his back as she spoke in rapid Japanese, and he glared at each of his brothers in turn, even as the words she didn't say melted his heart. She had been worried and had wanted to protect him, had come running to his rescue. "Are you all right?" he whispered in Japanese, weathering the curious looks and moving to shield her whenever one of his brothers dared to try to peek around him.
I'm dying of embarrassment.
She pressed her palms to his back.
Your brothers?
The very ones. As much as he loved them, he was considering killing all of them. Valen and Callistos moved a step closer to him, and Diamond sidestepped, trying to get a better view. Esher twisted and flashed teeth at all of them, the desire to snap and lash out at them growing stronger with each passing second. He could almost feel the trident on his wrist darkening, and his eyes turning stormy with it. Is she Hellspawn? Diamond leaned to his right, and Esher backed off a step towards the corridor, his other hand claiming Aiko's hip to keep her hidden behind him. With her pressed this close to him, it would be difficult for his brothers to be able to sense what she was. Gods, he hoped her grasp of English wasn't good enough to understand everything his brothers were saying. He didn't want them to frighten her with talk of things that were not of her world. Not yet. Not until they had grown closer, and he felt sure she wouldn't run away from him. A goddess? Marek frowned, but thankfully didn't move. At least one of his brothers had the sense not to provoke him. Is she the reason you were asking all those questions about the wards? She's definitely not a demon. Everyone looked at him. Esher cursed him for making the whole situation worse. That was meant to be a secret. Esher glared at him. I hope you enjoy the rain you'll be getting in Seville for the next month. Marek huffed, looked as if he wanted to argue as he crossed his arms across his chest, and then as if he was chewing on a wasp as he remained silent. Is she a carrier like Megan? Ares hadn't moved either, probably because he had been struck dumb. His older brother's face was a blank mask, and Esher had the feeling that he knew the answer to that question. Knew what Aiko was, but found it so incredible he couldn't comprehend it. A vampire? Valen offered. Marek glared at him. She'd better not be.
Kyuketsuki, chigao yo.
The Japanese words for vampire, you're wrong, were muffled against his back, Aiko's normally gentle voice holding a wealth of denial. She wriggled and poked her head under his left arm and spoke in English.
I am a woman, not a demon.
His brothers instantly sobered, all of the amusement fleeing their faces as they stared at her, and Esher glared at them as the rain started outside, pouring hard on the roof as his temper got the better of him, and a need to drive his brothers away before they started questioning her raged through him. Aiko's softly spoken words froze him in place, though.
I'm not like Esher. I'm human.
His eyes slowly widened in time with his brother's ones, and he needed to turn towards her and see her face when he asked her the question blazing in his heart, but he would expose her if he did, and then he would have to kill his brothers, because no one but him got to see her this naked. You know? Those two words hung in the air for an excruciating moment before her voice broke the silence to answer him.
Yes.
She wrapped her arms around him from behind, settling her hands on his stomach, and gods, it was a relief.
You're a water spirit, or a god, a good one.
How did you know? Damn, he wanted to see her, needed to look into her eyes and see that she really did know that he was a god, not like her, and she had always known. He needed to see that what he was wouldn't come between them. She rested her cheek against his back and spoke gently in Japanese, each word soothing him like a balm.
I knew the moment I met you, but I think I truly understood what you are when we were in the tea house, when I saw the ocean in your eyes and felt the power of the sea surging through you.
He was glad none of his brothers could understand her language as well as he could. Diamond grinned and said in perfect Japanese, Really? I bet you felt it surging into you, too. Aiko gasped. Esher growled, and the only thing stopping him from grabbing his brother and hurling him across the room was the fact he would expose Aiko by moving. Not a damned word. He shot his brother a glare, hoping Diamond would see in it all the painful ways he would make him suffer if he dared to tell any of his brothers what she had said. Leave them alone, Valen bit out, and when everyone turned surprised looks on him, he sighed. Leave them alone, or I'll rip off your heads and leave you to bleed to death in a gutter. Cal, Marek, and Ares grinned at that, and even Esher had to admit he was more comfortable with this side of Valen, the violent and tempestuous one that tried to turn everything into a brawl and preferred to tell the world to go to hell. Iko tugged him backwards towards the corridor, using him as a shield. He went with her because he didn't want his brothers seeing her either. When they reached it, her hand slipped from his stomach, and he mourned the loss of her touch as she broke contact with him. As the distance between them grew, it pulled at him as fiercely as the moon, calling him to her. "So we are definitely going out. All of us?" Cal wasn't going to let it go now that someone had suggested it. Not even the fact that Esher had a human in the house, an almost naked one at that, had distracted him from his mission to party, which was a relief in a way. Hopefully his other brothers would just roll with it too. Ares' earthy brown eyes locked on Esher, golden sparks lighting them up. "Let me get this straight. You lied to us last night so you could get a little sum-sum?" "No." Esher definitely hadn't lied for that reason. "It wasn't like that, but I'm sorry. You needed me and I wasn't there. You should have called. You know I would have fought. You all know that, right?" He shifted his gaze to each of his brothers in turn, needing to see on their faces that they did know he could be relied on, that he was as much a part of this fight as they were, and nothing would change that. "We do." Karis's deep voice was smooth, commanding, sounding much like their father. "But I wouldn't have called on you anyway. It's too dangerous. It was better you stayed within the wards." Cal's face twisted in grim lines, his eyes glowing brighter as he bit out, "But we are still all going out tonight?" Cal had always been one for a party, was happiest when he was lost in a crowd or swept up in a fight, or risking his damned neck on his motorcycle. He drowned himself in sensation, and Esher could understand why he felt the need to do that. To forget. In a way, it was Cal's way of coping. Esher had his music as a calming influence. Cal blew off steam to control his pain, used adrenaline to crush it. But now wasn't the time to go off half-cocked looking for a fight or getting caught up in dancing. "Maybe we shouldn't," he put in, and Cal glared at him, but he weathered it and continued. "With everything that has happened." Cal looked to Karis. Their oldest brother nodded. "We will go out, all of us, but only because we are all together. Esher will be safe." As if he needed protecting. He schooled his features so his brothers didn't see how much that pissed him off. He didn't want to go out either. He wanted to stay in the house with Iko. Karis's expression said it wasn't going to be an option, though, and he had the feeling his brother's change of heart had something to do with Iko. Esher was damned if he was going to go out just so Karis could lecture him while their other brothers were occupied with partying, or poke his nose into his business by demanding to know about her. "Take her home." Those 3 words, spoken with a regal and commanding air, had Esher baring his teeth at Karis, and unsurprised to feel his canines were sharper than normal, his darker side roused by his brother's demand. "You're not my boss," he snarled at Karis before he could think better of it and took a hard step towards him, the rain outside falling faster as the leash on his temper slipped. He curled his fingers into fists at his side, no longer caring if his brothers saw just how dark his trident mark was now, because he was damned sure the blackness of his eyes was giving away just how pissed he was. Ares muttered dryly, "I think I've heard those words before." Valen punched him on the arm. "You growled them better, and then you went off in a manly hissy fit." Ares glared at Valen. "It was not a hissy fit." Esher tuned them out as he focused on Karis, concentrating his rage on his oldest brother. Karis coolly regarded him, his green eyes impassive, not giving anything away. He hadn't understood at the time, but now he could see why Ares had wanted to punch his brother all the times Karis had stood there with that aloof air and demanded he let Megan go. Like fuck, he was letting Iko go, and Karis's demand was in order to do just that. "Be reasonable, Esher." Karis moved a calm step towards him, his face impassive, tone collected. "It's dangerous for her. You're dangerous for her." That stung, the barb sinking deep into his heart, tearing into it. "I'm not." Esher bit out, the conviction he felt making those words as hard and unyielding as steel. I would never hurt her. Karis remained still, steady, unflinching in front of him. Cal, Valen, and Marek exchanged looks that said they found it difficult to believe. Ares stood firm, a pillar of support that Esher badly needed. But it was Diamond who spoke up, moving to stand beside him, in his corner as always. You've known her a while now. She gave you the bandage. He nodded. I haven't hurt her yet, and I won't hurt her. He slid a black look at Karis. But I will hurt whoever tries to take her from me. Sounds like you. Valen nudged Ares, a grin tugging at his scar. Ares huffed. You're one to talk. Sounds more like our father, Marek added, and his other brothers all nodded in agreement, an air of thanks for that, Gene, Dad, about them. All but Karis. Karis still didn't move, didn't back down, just kept staring at Esher with that damned look in his eyes that said to do as he had ordered. It wasn't going to happen. He took a fierce step towards Karis, but Diamond blocked his path, and his gaze leaped to his brother's ice blue one as he spoke, his voice soft and rolling over him like a gentle tide. How did you meet? That had Esher settling back on his heels as a need swept through him, a desire to finally speak to Diamond about her. I was hurt after a demon attack on the gate, and I took the train. I fell asleep and woke after my stop. She was in the other carriage. A male. He was trying to hurt her, and I stopped him. I had to help her. He looked between Diamond's eyes, expecting to find surprise in them, but there was only warmth and understanding. He couldn't say the same about his other brothers, but he tuned out their comments and focused on Diamond in the way he always did when trying to ground himself. The rain fell harder, memories of that night of seeing Aiko in danger, rousing his anger to startling heights, that had a need to hunt down the human and destroy him, blasting through him. So you helped her, and then she helped you. Diamond's smooth voice rolled over him again, easing that need. You saw her again before I came to find you in Shibuya. You were acting different, and the weather was bloody awful. Why were you upset? I felt a need to hurt her. Escher's voice dropped to a bare whisper as he confessed that. Did you really want to do it? Or did you feel you should want to do it because it's how you always feel about humans? Escher considered that, dropping his eyes to his feet as he struggled to find the answer. Had he really wanted to hurt her? No. Even then, he had known that hurting her would be hurting himself. But he had been scared, confused by the feelings she had awoken in him, a need so powerful it overwhelmed him. He had feared she might hurt him, so the dark side of himself, his other side, had wanted to lash out first. He slowly shook his head. I never wanted to hurt her. I would never hurt her. He lifted his chin, stared into Diamond's eyes, and then at his brother's. He could see the questions rising in them, and he knew they were born of concern for him, but he shook his head again and implored them. Let it go. I'm having a hard enough time with this as it is. If it feels strange to you, imagine how it feels to me. He could understand their desire to protect him, and to protect Aiko, but they didn't need to worry about him. He was going to be fine. Aiko appeared in that moment, a crinkle between her fine dark eyebrows as she looked up at him, her eyes flooded with soft concern that said she could feel his conflict, and she wanted to soothe it. Gods, he wanted to drown in her when she looked at him like that. But his brothers also all looked at her, and Fine went right out of the window. He stepped in front of her, ushering her between him as they stared, a dark need to gouge out all of their eyes so they couldn't see her in her tiny ruffled black skirt, purple stockings, and black skull tank surging through him. Karis frowned at her and Esher shot him a glare, but his older brother didn't take his eyes off of her as she moved out from behind Esher to stand beside him again. Karis was testing him, trying to draw out his darker side and get a reaction from him. It wasn't going to happen. He wouldn't frighten Aiko like that. She pushed her skirt down, clearly uncomfortable with the scrutiny, and he considered letting loose on his brothers after all, because it was a guaranteed way to stop them all from staring at her. She looked up at him and softly said,
"It's getting late, and I have work waitressing tonight."
"No." He turned his frown on her now. He had plans, perfect plans. She couldn't go, not yet. She tilted her chin up, her face towards him, and smiled gently, a hint of sorrow in her dark eyes that he felt sure echoed in his own, as he faced a long night without her. He had wanted to learn more about her, had intended to take another bath and watch the sunset with her this time, and he had been planning to add just the right amount of cloud to make it incredible, as beautiful as she was. "A waitress where?" He forced himself to put his plans on hold, because as much as he wanted to convince her to ditch work and spend the evening with him instead, he knew Callistos wasn't going to let a night on the town go, now that Karis had given it the green light. His younger brother would insist he join them in the no-ladies' night, and he would end up parted from Iko anyway.
"Vampire Cafe. But I'm not a vampire," she said, her English a little stilted as she looked at Mark. "Just a human."
Everyone still looked shocked when she mentioned that fact about herself, and Esher wanted to tell them to go, leave the house and not come back until they had come to terms with the fact there was one human in this God's forsaken world that he didn't want to kill.
"It's your birthday?"
She shifted her soft gaze to Cal, who nodded, causing a rogue strand of his blonde hair to fall down his cheek. Cal brushed it back, smoothing it into his ponytail, and shot her a charming smile. Iko mercifully returned her gaze to Esher before he had to kill his brother for stealing her attention for too long, and spoke in Japanese.
"I could get you a booth. If you show up when we open, then it's normally quiet."
Esher translated for her when 5 of his brothers tossed him curious glances. Iko added in English,
"We have delicious cocktails."
Everyone looked at Valen and said as one, "No alcohol." "Dinner in a club sounds good." Cal had practically disappeared into his room nearest the TV area when he hollered, "I call first dibs on the shower." Iko grabbed Esher's hand and pulled him away from everyone, tugging him along the walkway to his room. She didn't stop when they reached it. She led him around the corner so they were alone above the pond and his brothers couldn't see them. He groaned when she tiptoed and kissed him, her lips temptingly sweet and soft as they glided over his. He dipped, wrapped his arms around her, and pulled her closer, kissing her deeper as he let everything else fall away, until there was only her. "Wait," he murmured against her lips, peppering them with kisses as awareness grew inside him, a feeling that she meant this as a goodbye kiss before she went to work. "We can go together." He thought she might refuse, but then she kissed him again and whispered,
"I like how protective you are."
Fuck. She didn't know how deep that protective streak she liked ran, just what lengths he would go to in order to make sure that she was safe and unharmed, and would always have a reason to smile and laugh. He would do anything for her, whatever it took, and as he kissed her, the reason behind that need hit him hard. He was falling in love with her. Chapter 13. Esher thought the sight of Iko in her usual clothing had made her impossible to resist. He had been mistaken. She had every single drop of his attention, had his heart pounding and fingers itching with a need to sweep her up into his arms, as she moved around the warmly lit room, drifting past the black coffin laden with red candles on its top, leading another couple into one of the booths behind the swag of a red velvet curtain. He had to dig his nails into the black wooden table in front of him as she bowed, coming close to flashing her panties at the rest of the room in her ridiculous uniform. She looked like a fucking French maid, and damn, it got his blood pumping. He just wasn't sure whether it was with a need to fight or make love with her, or possibly both. She straightened, her hands still tucked in front of her white apron that sat over the short black dress, and spoke with the newcomers, her smile bright as she recited the same thing she had said to everyone she had brought into the Gothic room. Esher raked his eyes over her for what felt like the millionth time, unable to stop himself, letting them glide from the little white frill that arched over her head on a band, down over her black dress that thankfully covered her chest and her upper arms, too, all the way down to the white stockings that started just a few inches below the end of her skirt. The tops of them had frills, too, and gods, he kept imagining smoothing them down her shapely legs, kissing every inch of milky skin he exposed. One of the other groups called her over, and he barely stopped himself from rising from the red velvet couch that curved around the table, his eyes tracking her through the sheer black curtain that draped across both sides of the booth, tied to the gaudy gold columns that looked as if they were meant to be supporting the roof. The table of males all grinned and jostled as they spoke to her, and she smiled at them. Esher growled. He was going to kill them. He was going to kill every damned male in the room, and then he was going to cover her with his coat and take her far away from this place. He couldn't bear it. The sight of so many males paying attention to her when she was dressed in such a way, it was too much. She bowed and giggled, doing only what was expected of her, but gods, it grated. So immortal, huh? Ares did his best to distract him, but Esher didn't rise to the bait, just kept tracking her around the room as she relayed the order to the backroom staff, and then reappeared, seating another group in the busy room, this one at the table near the coffin. He assessed all the males in the mixed group, none of which were a match for him. Anyone else? Ares sounded pissed, and he felt his brother's gaze leave him. Valen, be a dick or something. Valen growled at Ares. Why? You're being a big enough dick for both of us, asking him about her being a human. It was odd having Valen in his corner. It almost distracted him for a second. Almost. But then a group wanted to photograph the resident male vampire, a human dressed in formal attire with fake fangs, and one Mark had spent most of the evening glaring at, and Esher saw red when the male picked Aiko as his victim. Again. As the male took hold of her from behind and pretended to bite her throat as she held her hands up in front of her, mock surprise on her face, Esher shoved to his feet. His brothers were too fast for him, though. Before he could move, Ares had left the opposite side of the booth and had hemmed him in, and all he could do was shuffle further along the curved red sofa to accommodate him as his brothers all moved along one place, putting Valen near the other end now. Diamond sat beside Valen, offering Esher an apologetic look that told him if he had been nearest to the edge and not Ares, he wouldn't have stopped him from stepping in. I need the toilet. Esher was tempted to shove Ares, but the chances of getting scalded were high, and the last thing he needed to do was cause his older brother's temper to spark. The whole place would probably burn down, although it would mean that Aiko couldn't work here anymore, and that damned male couldn't touch her again. The vampire released her and went back to his station, serving other customers. Karis gave Esher a doubtful look. If you want her attention, you only have to ring. His older brother reached across the cluttered table, picked up the tiny brass bell, and shook it. Aiko immediately came over, her warm eyes locking straight on Esher as she readied her notepad. What do you want? Esher raked his gaze over her, hunger gnawing at him. What didn't he want? He wanted to devour her, over and over again. Water, he said instead, not wanting to make her blush in front of his brothers. She didn't seem surprised by his request, just smiled and wrote it down and then looked at his brothers. The air spirit needs another drink. Ares finished his fruity non-alcoholic cocktail at that moment. Aiko took the glass as he pushed it away from him and said in English, Would you like another fire spirit? Bring us all the same again. Karis's green eyes were sharp as he eyed her, and Esher didn't like it. He scowled at his brother where he sat in the middle of the table, Mark and Cal flanking him, and then pushed aside his irritation so he could enjoy the sight of Aiko again. She cleared some plates from the table with the help of another waitress, and then disappeared into the kitchen, smiling and giggling to her companion as she went. She was so vibrant, so full of life. His little butterfly. Can she read? Karis said. Esher absently said, I presume so. Japanese definitely, but she studied English, so maybe a little of that too. Karis huffed. No. Read. He dragged his focus away from Aiko, settling it on Karis, and frowned as he thought about that. She must be able to. Because he hadn't told her what he was, and she had pinpointed Cal and Ares' powers without witnessing them, which meant she was a carrier, a human with hellspawn blood in their ancestry. Megan, Ares' female, was a carrier too, possessing the talent to heal. Aiko could sense things in people, able to read the truth about them, The other form of carrier could see the future in visions. Karis plucked the damned bell from the table and rang again, and Esher's gut tightened, his mood taking a nosedive as he realized what his brother was going to do. He had tested Megan, and he was going to test Aiko. Aries gave Karis a black look, one that relayed he was as happy about their brother's plan as Esher was, and he wanted to argue against it. When Aiko arrived, all smiles and light, Karis stared at her, blocking him out, and said, "What am I thinking?" Her face fell as she swallowed hard and glanced at Esher. He tried to reach for Karis, wanting to punch the bastard for making her so nervous, but Cal caught his arm and held him back. A dangerous move on his little brother's part. Holding him back was like trying to hold back a tidal wave. You just didn't do it unless you wanted to get hurt.
I don't invade people's heads like that. It is rude.
She shook her head, and he could see she didn't want to do it, was afraid of what might happen if she did. "Leave her alone," he growled, and she looked at him, her nerves fading a little as their eyes met. He gentled his tone. "You don't have to do this." She looked back at Karis, and gods, he admired her when she stood a bit taller and squared her shoulders. She took a deep breath and stared at Karis for so long Esher started to get twitchy again, restless with a need to stop her from looking at his brother. A wrinkle formed between her eyebrows as she focused harder.
"Books,"
she said, and then she shook her head.
"Not books. I meant to read your mind."
"Keep going." Karis's voice was dark, challenging, and the need to punch his brother grew stronger, because he was pushing her, ordering her around as if she belonged to him or was his to command. Megan found it hard to heal them because they were gods, and it was obvious Aiko was struggling to read Karis. It was taking its toll on her. She glanced at him, gave a tiny dip of her head to say she was fine, one that did nothing to ease the need to give his brother a makeover with his fists, and then looked back at Karis and focused again. Her eyes turned glassy.
"Your thoughts hazy."
She swayed a little and reached out to grip the ebony table, leaned towards it and his brother as she peered deeper into his green eyes.
"You are gods. I understand."
She went deeper still.
"What's in your pocket? You want something in your—"
"Get out of my head," Karis snapped, and shadows whipped towards her, but Valen had her out of their path in an instant, tugging her towards him as she flinched and closed her eyes, her hand flying to her forehead as if Karis had physically struck her. Gods only knew what would have happened if his shadows had. Ares was quick to move aside, leveling a hard look at Karis. Esher was out of the booth and beside her in a heartbeat, taking her from Valen and checking her over, leaving no inch of her uninspected as a need to see that she was unhurt raged through his blood. "Are you all right?" He smoothed his thumb over her brow as she cupped her head, across the point she had touched when she had flinched, and relief beat through him when she nodded and opened her eyes, and lifted them to his, and he saw in them that she was. He turned his head towards his brother, clenched his jaw, and bit out, "Happy now?" Karis lowered his eyes to the table and didn't respond. His hands gripped the black wood so fiercely his knuckles were white, and Esher wanted to ask him what it was in his pocket that he desired and wanted to keep hidden from him and his brothers. What did he want to protect so much that he had been willing to harm a human to keep it secret? Ares looked as if he wanted the answer to that question too. If Karis dared to push Aiko around again, if he so much as looked at her funnily, then Esher was damned well going to find out. He watched his older brother twisting the silver band he wore on his thumb around it, his eyes on it, a glimmer of something like pain in their emerald depths. For now, Esher would let it go. They were meant to be celebrating Cal's birthday, not getting into a fight. He shifted his gaze back to Aiko. "You're sure you're all right?" She nodded, and he reluctantly released her when a few of the waitresses started looking his way and talking to each other. Aiko moved away, but he didn't miss the way she frowned at Karis before she went back to work. Karis looked away again when Esher glared at him and slid back into the booth, on the edge of the red velvet seat this time, hemming Ares in against Cal. "You serious about her? You seem serious. She seems a little young." "Valen," Ares snapped. Valen shrugged, his shoulders casually rolling beneath his tight black t-shirt. What? I'm just saying what you're all thinking. We all know Escher's history with humans is as black as Styx. What's the deal? Escher had thought they had agreed not to do this. He ignored them and continued to watch her. When she came with their drinks, he took his from her, and 1,000 volts leaped along his bones when their fingers brushed. She stared up at him, eyes wide, deep, dark pools that he fell into, forgetting the world for a heartbeat. He leaned towards her, wanting to kiss her, and stopped himself at the last second, aware she was being watched again. She broke away, a blush staining her cheeks, and hugged the silver tray to her chest as she headed back towards the kitchen. When she reached the other waitresses, they all burst into giggles. There's no doubt she likes you. Escher turned a glare on Diamond. I expected comments from them, but not from you. Diamond just smiled, a teasing one that said he wasn't going to hear the end of this for a while. Are you serious about her? Karis this time, and everyone looked at him again, seeming as surprised as he was to hear their older brother speak again so soon. Escher looked back at Aiko and watched her as she talked with the other waitresses, all bright and beautiful. She's different to everyone. She made him see there was good in this world and gave him a reason to protect it. When she took a tray of drinks and brought them to his table, setting them down in front of Valen, Diamond, and Cal, he waited impatiently for her to be done. The second she lowered her tray, he caught her free hand, brought it to his lips, and pressed a kiss to it. She blushed again. I'll be scolded. But she didn't take her hand away. She lingered, showing him that she wanted his kiss, needed his hands on her, ached for the contact as fiercely as he did. He groaned and relinquished her hand and watched her go, that restless need gnawing at him. He wasn't sure how much longer he could go without holding her again, touching her again, kissing her again. It was driving him crazy. He felt his brothers watching him, but he couldn't take his eyes off Aiko, barely heard them as they spoke, lost in her and the need spiraling through him, one more ferocious than he had ever experienced before, one that stemmed from the deepest place in his heart, in his soul. Aries' words broke through, quietly spoken and with a teasing note that said he was being only half serious, but they struck Escher hard as he felt the gravity of them and knew them to be true. I think he's in love. Diamond's muttered response echoed his thoughts. God's help the world. Chapter 14. Aiko pointed to the sign on the street marking the basement bar. It was one of her favorites in the Roppongi district. The skyscrapers towered above it, bright in the darkness, and the street was busy even at the late hour, people coming and going between the entertainment establishments in the area. A black taxi pulled up outside the club, and 2 women clambered out of it, said something to the driver, and disappeared down the steps. As Escher's brothers moved off ahead of them, blending into the night in their black clothing, looking like a group of deadly assassins as they prowled towards the steps that led down into the club, Escher slowed. She slowed with him, a feeling growing within her with each step further his brothers moved from them, a heavy weight that pressed down on her and would only be lifted when they were alone, when she could touch Escher again, could kiss him as she had been dying to all night. She had caught the need that had flared in him from time to time throughout the night, an ache that had flared in her too, had made her burn whenever his eyes had followed her, or she had looked at him. It had blazed hotter than the sun when he had taken hold of her after Karis had made her read his dark mind, and again when he had kissed her hand. She had never wanted to be alone with a man like this before, had never yearned with a need to run away and construct a wall around them both to isolate them from the world. I'm sorry about my brother, Escher said in Japanese, as he lingered on the pavement near the steps, watching his brother's head inside, and she didn't stop him when he took hold of her hand. His was cool against it, but it warmed her, sending a pleasant hot wave rolling through her that had her stepping towards him. Darkness reigned in his eyes, anger that she wanted to soothe.
It was difficult, but I did not mind doing it.
Because she had the feeling it had been important. She just wasn't sure why. Before she could ask Escher, he tugged her towards the entrance of the club, leading her down the steps. He pushed the heavy door open and held it for her. Rather than moving through the crowd towards his brothers where they stood near the bar, gaining curious glances from many of the people in the club, Esher tugged her left, into the shadows. Her heart leaped into her throat as he pulled her in front of him, beating frantically as he backed her into the corner and hemmed her in with his body, planting his hands on either side of her head. He breathed hard and she could feel his struggle. It echoed her own. She caught hold of the sides of his dark gray shirt near his collar, tugged him towards her, and moaned when he dipped his head and captured her lips, his breath hissing from him as he kissed her. Damn, she needed him. It had been building inside her all night. She had been watching him, too, putting up with her friends' teasing. Each second agony as she had counted the minutes until her shift would end and she could be with him again. More than once she had wanted him to come to her, had wanted to sneak away with him into one of the empty booths and steal a kiss like this. She opened for him, and he groaned and shuddered as his tongue tangled with hers. Her grip on his shirt tightened, and then she gave herself over to the need rising inside her, vanquishing her nerves. She released his shirt and pressed her palms against his chest, moaned as the feel of his hard muscles and his heart pounding frantically against her hands sent a warm shiver through her. He pressed into her, kissing her harder, so hungrily that she got caught up in his fervor, forgot the world existed and they weren't alone. He shifted his hips closer, and she trembled as she felt his hardness against her belly. Her hands shook as a need went through her, a wicked one that had her blushing. One she had to obey. It felt as if her very life depended on satisfying it. She skimmed her left hand down his chest, feeling the tempting ridges of his stomach as he tensed, his breath hitching as he kissed her, driving her mad with a need for more. She trailed her fingers over the belt of his black jeans and hesitated for only a second before turning her hand and cupping his rigid length. Esher groaned and whispered against her lips, "Touch me. I need you." Aiko's cheeks blazed, awareness of everyone crashing back down around her, but it didn't stop her from doing it because she needed to feel him too. She rubbed her palm up and down his length as he kissed her, his moans quiet enough that no one would hear them over the thumping music, and the corner dark enough that she was sure no one could see what they were doing. But damn, she wasn't sure she would care if someone did. All that mattered was satisfying the need that had been steadily building inside her all night. "Fuck, you're killing me," he uttered against her lips, kissed her again, and then pressed his forehead against hers, his breathing as ragged as her own. "Put me out of my misery. I want to leave right now, go to that tea house, make love with you." She wanted that too, his words setting fire to a deeper need, one that had her leaning closer to him, trapping her hand between their bodies. She wanted him, all of him. It frightened her but excited her more. She tiptoed and kissed him, hard this time, unable to hold back any longer, needing to show him that he wasn't alone and she ached for him too, wanted to fulfill that vision he had painted of them together at the tea house, making love beneath the moon. Aiko froze and broke away from his lips, her gaze scanning the crowded room as a feeling arrowed through her. "Why did you stop?" Esher dropped his head to her neck, devouring it with kisses. His hands clutched her hips, drawing her against him. "I still can't believe you know I'm a god and you want to be with me."
"I've been able to sense spirits for a long time now."
She pressed her hands against his chest, pushing him back to stop him from distracting her, overloading her with sensation. The feeling grew clearer, her ability pinpointing his brothers and him, and something else.
"That's why I can feel something is wrong. There are no spirits here. Bad spirits."
Esher immediately grabbed her and pulled her swiftly through the crowd. His brothers jeered as they approached. "Scatter, now!" His words seemed slowed in her ears as she spotted one of the spirits she had sensed at the entrance of the club. The dark-haired male lifted his hand, his thumb coming down on something he held.
"Run!"
Aiko shoved Esher hard, heart slamming against her ribs as adrenaline and fear surged through her. A wave of heat and light rolled through the room, and Esher twisted her into his arms, pinning her against the bar and shielding her with his body. There was a deafening bang, the floor bucked hard, almost sending her to her knees, and then screams rang around her. But the explosion didn't reach her and Esher or his brothers. She stared at Karis where he stood beyond Esher with both hands outstretched in front of him, at the flames and debris that hid an invisible barrier just inches from him, at the blood that rolled down it like rain on a window. Her stomach lurched, the sickening stench of burning flesh and other things assaulting her nose. She pulled back to check Esher wasn't hurt. Cold crimson eyes looked down at her, and then he was gone. Iko sagged against the bar, heart frozen in her chest as Esher disappeared in a swirl of black smoke, only to reappear on the other side of Karis's barrier. He let out an inhuman snarl as he shoved the humans in his path aside, heading towards a second attacker. The fair-haired man fumbled with the detonator in his hand. Before he could press the button, Esher had appeared behind him and had ripped the vest of explosives off him. The man frantically pressed the button as Esher held the vest up and glared at it and then at him. A cruel smile twisted Esher's lips when it didn't detonate. The man tried to run, and his feelings struck her. Fear. He hadn't been afraid to die when he had been on the verge of detonating himself, but now he was terrified. Because Esher was going to kill him. Some part of her thought she should stop him as she watched him capture the man by his throat and lift him from the floor, that she should be horrified by what he was doing as he stared at the man, his eyes blazing scarlet but as cold as ice. The rest of her wanted him to do it. She wanted the man to pay for what he had done, hurting countless innocent people, and what he had intended to do, killing those now struggling to escape, clawing their way towards the destroyed exit or away from Esher where he held the man aloft, staring at him. Do it. It was wrong of her, but she wanted him to do it. Esher's eyes narrowed slowly. The man began to flail, frantically kicking at Esher's legs and clawing at his arms, a wild thing in his grip, a grip that slowly tightened until the man was choking. No, she realized as she watched blood trickle from the man's nose, appearing black to her, and from his eyes, and saw it begin to creep from his ears. It wasn't Esher's grip that was making him choke. It was Esher's power. She could feel it rising in him, and it was a dark and terrible tide, fueled by anger that had his lips twisting in a satisfied sneer as he watched the man bleed. The man convulsed, shaking violently in Esher's grip. But Esher remained unmoving, his arms steady and eyes locked on him, no trace of emotion in them as he watched the man bleed out. The man coughed up blood, thick streams of it that ran over his chin and formed a puddle below his feet, where they dangled at least 8 inches off the ground, splattering across the rubble and sending dust up into the air. People continued to pull themselves away from him, desperate cries leaving their lips as they forced themselves to move. Their fear pushing down on Iko together with their pain, pulling her focus to them. They needed her help. When she moved, Esher's gaze whipped to her. His expression darkened. The man threw his head back and blood burst from his lips, cascading down his face, and then he went still. Esher dropped the body, turned crimson eyes on the people crawling away from him. "Esher, don't!" Diamond called and was moving in an instant. A cold feeling went through Iko. He was going to hurt the people next. "Esher!" She took a step towards him instead of the people she had intended to help, and he looked at her again. A flicker of blue shone in amidst the red of his irises. Fire exploded in a wave behind him, knocking him forwards, and one of his brothers screamed his name. A wall of ice and earth shot up behind him, creating a barrier, but not before the tip of the explosion caught Esher, the force of it hurling him to his knees on the rubble from the first blast. Iko was by his side in an instant, her heart in her mouth as she saw the torn-up back of his shirt, a slick patch on the back of his head, and lacerations on his neck. "Esher!" She flooded her hands over him, panic claiming hold of her, and then her mind emptied and her heart steadied, and something clicked into place inside her. She instinctively followed her training, checking him from head to toe for wounds and any sign of broken bones. No sound reaching her ears other than her own ragged, strained breathing. When she saw only superficial wounds, she risked taking hold of his shoulders. He responded instantly. In the blink of an eye, she was tucked against his chest, his body shielding hers again, and his grip was so tight she found it hard to breathe. He shook against her, hands trembling where they gripped the nape of her neck and her waist, pinning her to him. "Need to protect my little butterfly," he whispered. "Keep it together and protect my little butterfly." She realized that was her. She wrapped her arms around him as best she could, holding him.
I'm fine. I can't sense any more of the bad spirits.
He refused to release her, kept her crushed against his chest, safe. His shaking worsened, and she caught his emotions as they grew stronger. Rage, fear, and a darkness that frightened her a little, but she could also feel that he needed her, and that need was genuine. Diamond stopped beside them, and she looked up his long black denim-clad legs, over his dark roll-neck sweater to his face. He crouched beside Esher, his pale blue eyes on him, concern flooding them. "Everyone is safe," Diamond murmured, the words in odd contrast to the sobs and moans of the people around them, people who were injured, dying. He didn't seem to notice as he focused on Esher. "Everyone is safe. The demons are gone. You dealt with them. The threat is over. Everyone is safe. Focus on my voice, Esher. Focus on me now." When Esher only held her closer and loosed another inhuman growl, Diamond glanced at his brothers, his expression revealing fear. Why? "Tycho," Diamond whispered and held his hand out, slowly, as if he was approaching a dangerous animal and feared getting his hand bitten off if he startled it. He kept his voice low, a soothing murmur. "Tycho. Focus on the word, Esher. Focus on me. Tycho." Every time Diamond said that strange word, Esher's grip on her loosened a little, and she could breathe again. His trembling began to subside. "Everything is okay now. Everyone is fine. Everyone is safe. See?" Diamond hovered his hand an inch from Esher's shoulder. "Look." Esher drew back, but he didn't look at his brother. He looked at her. Iko lifted her dirty hands and framed his face, keeping his eyes on her. They were blue again now, blue but so inky they were almost black, and only spots of crimson remained. Whatever that crimson meant, it was bad, and she wanted to know why it happened, and what to do to bring Esher back, as Diamond had. Beyond him, Ares appeared in a swirl of black smoke that clung to him and the pretty brunette woman in his arms. "What happened?" She sounded American. Her warm brown eyes rose to Ares when she noticed the body of the creature Diamond had referred to as a demon. "That looks like a nasty way to go." "Better than exploding." Ares nodded to the spots where the other two demons had detonated themselves, one close to where they had appeared and the other beyond the crumbling wall of dirt and melting ice. Iko wasn't sure the demon Esher had killed had experienced a death that had been better than the other two. It had been drawn out, excruciating. Esher had made sure that he had suffered, because he had felt a need to protect his brothers. Her. She looked back at him, at the way he was watching her closely, his dark eyebrows furrowed with concern that flickered in his eyes, and knew she was the reason he had lost control. When the woman started helping the injured, Iko tried to get free of Esher's grip so she could help. He immediately dragged her against him, his grip so fierce it hurt. "I can help too," she said, but he showed no sign of releasing her. Her eyes darted between his. "I have to help, Esher. Let me help them." Let her help. Diamond weathered the glare Esher turned on him. "Everyone is safe now. Everyone is okay." Esher drew down a deep, shuddering breath and closed his eyes as he nodded, but he still didn't release her. Iko brushed her thumbs across his cheeks, smearing the ash and blood. "I'm safe, Esher. No one will hurt me, and I am not afraid, because I know you will protect me." He sucked down another deep breath, leaned forwards and pressed his forehead against her neck, and she stroked her palms over his back and frowned as she felt the blood on her hands. His blood. She needed to tend to him, too, but there were people in far more need of her than he was. She looked at the people, at the ones who had already died, and those struggling to stem the flow of blood from their wounds, or desperately trying to help others. "Please, Esher." Because she couldn't sit idle any longer, she had to help them. He inhaled hard, exhaled in another shuddering sigh, and finally released her. She stood, her legs like jelly beneath her, body shaking as the adrenaline dump waned, and she was left facing the cold reality of what had happened. The lights in the large room flickered on and off, and smoke curled from several places, making the air thick and hot and difficult to breathe. She pushed herself to move, told herself that there were no more demons left, that there was only Esher and his brothers, and the injured. She had to help them. She picked her way over the rubble to the woman Aries guarded, and her eyes widened when she realized the brunette didn't have a medical kit. She was healing the injured by holding her hands above them. The wounds beneath her touch knitted back together, and Aiko could only stare in amazement. She didn't have such an incredible gift, but she could do her part.
"Let me help,"
Aiko said in English, and the woman looked up. She nodded.
"There should be a med kit. Grab it and patch up as many of the people with less life-threatening injuries."
"We need to get motoring or the authorities will arrive." Aries' deep voice became a growl when the woman winced, leaned forwards, and shook her head. He stooped and touched her back. "Megan, you're overdoing it." She shot him a frown.
"I'm fine. Stop fussing." "I'll help."
Aiko hurried across the room, feeling Escher's eyes tracking her, and searched behind the bar for the med kit. There were two. She took both and tended to a wound on the bartender's throat first, and then one on the leg of a woman. She moved from person to person, her heart growing heavier as she did her best to help as many of the people as she could, their blood and dirt from the blast coating her hands and her clothes as she worked quickly. So many of them were dead, though. She stopped near a woman, one of the group she had seen exiting the taxi when they had arrived, and checked for a pulse. When she felt nothing, she sank back on her knees and stared at the woman, cold blooming inside her as her eyes burned, and hot tears spilled onto her cheeks.
"Can you help over here?"
Megan called. Aiko brushed her tears away, pushed onto her feet, and forced herself to move. But she couldn't stop herself from looking at every body she passed, and the tears returned, streaming down her cheeks no matter how hard she tried to stop them. When she reached Megan and sank to her knees, she felt Escher's eyes on her. She looked across at him as she applied pressure to a leg wound on a man while Megan worked to heal another on his side where a pipe had pierced him. Worry danced in his blue eyes, his expression relaying his need to come to her and comfort her. But he kept his distance, and all the light in his eyes turned dark when he glanced at the man she was helping. "Esher." Karis regained his attention. "It wasn't me who sensed the demons. It was Aiko." When Esher said that, Karis looked at her. He beckoned her with a wave of his hand, but he could wait because she was needed where she was. She ignored him and kept pressure on the wound, still amazed at the way Megan was healing the man. When Megan had closed the wound on his side, she smiled shakily.
"Thanks."
Megan reached for the man's leg as he moaned, and Aries palmed her shoulders. "You're doing great, sweetheart," he murmured. "A couple more and we're done." She nodded, blew out her breath, and focused. Aiko rose to her feet and brushed her tangled black hair from her face as she went to Esher. The moment she was within reach, he slipped his arm around her waist and pulled her to him, nuzzling her neck and holding her tightly. She sank against him, tired and aching, wanting to leave the carnage and try to put it all out of her mind, even when she knew it would haunt her for weeks. "How many demons did you sense?" Kara said.
4.
She wasn't really certain, just as she found it hard to distinguish how many of Escher's brothers were near her when they were grouped together. Becoming a mass of signatures to her, she had found it hard to count the number of demons. He frowned. 4? She nodded.
"Or 3? It's hard to say."
"There's a big difference between 3 and 4. Kara swiped a hand over his short black hair, his green gaze dark and handsome face etched in pensive lines as he stared down at her. 3 died. If there were 4, then 1 survived." She focused on the feeling she'd had when she had been making out with Esher in the shadows. At first, it had felt like one bad spirit, but then she remembered it breaking apart, and that was when she had alerted Esher, because there had been 3 of them.
3.
She was sure of it now. Above them, sirens rang out, muffled through the layers of concrete. "Time to leave." Karis looked at his brothers. "Merrick and I will finish up here. It won't take long to make the survivors believe there was a gas leak that caused the explosions." They could do that? Aiko looked at the room, and she supposed it wasn't that much of a leap. It was wrecked, the floor torn up in a way that made it appear as if a gas main had burst. The lightning and air spirit disappeared, leaving shimmering black smoke behind. Aries dragged Megan onto her feet, ignoring her protest as she tried to reach another person to help them, and disappeared with her. Diamond, go with Esher. Make sure he is all right. Karis looked to the white-haired one, and the man nodded. Because Esher was injured, or because he had lost control? Karis slapped a hand down on Esher's shoulder. Everyone is fine. Esher nodded, but didn't look convinced.
But the people...
Iko tried to pull towards them as a few of them moaned, and one cried out for help. It could take hours for the authorities to break through the rubble, closing the entrance and reach them. They might die if she didn't help them. Esher turned cold eyes on them, his tone empty. We've done all we can. He pulled her against him, and the world spun around her, fading to black. Colors emerged, streaking through the darkness, and her head kept on spinning as Esher's house appeared around her. He kept hold of her as Diamond appeared. The first thing Diamond said was, Everyone is fine. Esher dragged a hand over his messy black hair and nodded, and she felt cold as he released her, breaking contact and moving away, drifting towards the bathhouse. She watched him go, her insides tied in knots as she tried to decide whether to go after him and help him or question his brother. When he disappeared from view, questioning won out, because she needed some answers. She turned on Diamond.
People were dead. They were hurt. Not everyone was fine.
Diamond looked over his shoulder towards the bathroom as the water started running. To Esher they were. He sighed and returned his ice-blue gaze to her. Everyone who mattered was fine. His brothers were fine. And so were you.
What about the people?
She didn't understand. Esher had always been so nice around her, caring and gentle. But tonight he had been different. She had seen the way he had looked at the injured people after he had killed the demon. He had wanted to hurt them. She frowned as something dawned on her, and she wasn't sure how she hadn't noticed it before. Esher hated being in a crowd. He seemed happiest when they were alone, somewhere peaceful, away from people. She had thought it was just because he wanted to be alone with her, but now she could see it for what it really was. He didn't like people. He didn't trust them. Why? She looked to Diamond for the answer. He was quiet for a long time, tensed and still, a statue in black in front of her, the soft long spikes of his white hair dirty and stained with crimson in places, and ash streaking across his pale skin. You've seen his scars? The ones on his back, on his wrists? She nodded. There were so many of them. Long silvery lines on his back, and thicker rings of scars on his arms. He looked as if he had fought 1,000 battles that had been worse than the one tonight, and the one she had patched him up after on the night they had met. Ever wonder where he got them? Diamond glanced towards the corridor to the bathroom and lowered his voice. If you need answers, you could start by asking him, because not even I know the full story. Tonight you were okay, and so were we. But it might be different next time. And you need to know what you're getting yourself into. He disappeared, leaving ribbons of black smoke behind, before she could ask him what that meant, giving her no choice but to ask Esher instead. She hesitated, a touch of fear trickling through her. Esher hadn't liked it when she had looked at his scars. How would he react if she asked about them? She had wanted to more than once, needed to know the story behind them, because she felt sure knowing was vital if she was going to move closer to him, as close as she wanted to be. She pulled down a steadying breath. She didn't want to hurt him, but she needed to know. She needed to know what had happened to him to make him so unfeeling towards humans, because gods were meant to protect them, not despise them. Iko kicked off her shoes and bravely strode forwards, following the trail of ashy boot prints that led to the bathhouse. She found Esher to the left, where a series of shower stalls were set into a stone wall. He stood beneath the spray, his head bent as he leaned with his hands against the white tiles, the water cascading over his black hair, down the tensed muscles of his bare back and over the contours of his bottom. He didn't seem to notice her as she stripped down to her underwear, or as she stepped into the cubicle behind him. He kept standing there with his head under the water, letting it run over him as if it would carry everything that was bothering him away. Iko touched his back, feathering her fingers along the most vicious of the scars. one that started in a thick circle below his left ribs and darted up towards his right shoulder, growing thinner as it went. He didn't tense as expected or turn to rail at her and make her stop.
"How did you get these?"
she whispered, voice trembling as badly as her fingers. He let out a long sigh. "What did Diamond tell you?"
"Nothing."
She stroked a smaller, thinner scar that arced over his spine.
"He told me to ask you."
He stood silent as she explored him, charted more scars, and then her eyes drifted to the ones around his arms, the ones she had wanted to know about from the moment she had met him. She wanted to reach for him, to caress them and ask him about them in particular, but he started to tremble as his hands tensed against the tiles, fingers pressing in as if he needed to grip them to keep himself upright, to stop himself from falling. Her heart ached for him, chest growing tight as she felt his struggle, his immense pain. He slowly turned his head towards her, and that ache deepened as his blue eyes met hers. They were as deep as the ocean, as blue as the sky, but there was a thread of a storm in them and a touch of crimson. He shifted towards her, claimed her cheeks with his palms, and stared down into her eyes. Water rolled down the long black lengths of his hair, but when it dripped, it hung in the air, suspended between them as he shook. "I'm glad you're okay," he croaked, and tears filled his eyes, tearing at her. "But I'm not. And I haven't been for a long time." Chapter 15. He shouldn't do this. It was dangerous. Not for her, but for him. He shouldn't trust her. She was human. But she was Aiko, and she needed to know. For the first time in his life, Esher needed to tell someone about his past, needed to lower that barrier and let someone step through it. It was vital. That feeling rang deep in his bones, vibrated in his soul, sang in his heart. Telling Aiko, revealing the darker part of himself, was vital, and it had to be now, before things went any further between them. Because if she found out later, when he was so lost in her, so in love with her that he couldn't live without her, and she left him, it didn't bear thinking about. The whole world would know his wrath. Esher stared down into her warm brown eyes, aware that his still held a hint of crimson, and that she had caught a glimpse of that side of himself he fought to keep under control. It had been but a shadow of his other self, provoked by the thought of her in danger, born of a need to protect her. But she had witnessed it. She had watched him kill that demon, drawing out his death and making him suffer, giving the wretch what he had deserved. There had been no condemnation in her eyes, though, no trace of horror or disgust as he had made the demon bleed. He wasn't fool enough to believe that meant she wouldn't run when she knew the truth about him, though. He broke away from her, needing some space and room to breathe, to gather his thoughts so he could figure out where to start. The beginning sounded good, but that came with its own perils, like revealing his age to her. She knew he was a god, had probably had contact with other creatures she believed were spirits, and she had never shied away from him because of it. She didn't seem to care that there was a possibility he was thousands of years older than her. He clung to that as he sank onto his backside on one of the stools and dragged his left hand down his face, his nerves threatening to get out of control. He drew down a deep breath and then another, and focused on each one to calm himself. Aiko crossed the short span of floor to him, but rather than stop in front of him, she filled one of the scoops with water and wetted a cloth and moved around behind him. He kept still as she dabbed at his back with the damp cloth, absorbed her gentle touch and the care behind it as she worked to clean him. The wound stung, but the pain was lost on him as he focused on her and on his past. "I never used to be like this," he murmured, and cleared his throat when his voice sounded raw, fragile. He didn't want to remember, but it was necessary. Aiko would keep him calm. He wouldn't hurt her. He stared at the showers, watching the water running as she carefully cleaned his back, tending to his wounds. The droplets danced, and he played with them, needing to keep his mind occupied as he let it all spill out. He kept part of his focus on Aiko, though, monitoring her because he needed to know if anything he told her frightened her, or pushed her away. He needed to feel her every reaction to what he was going to tell her. 6 centuries ago, my father Hades sent me on a mission to the mortal realm to meet a demigod and bring him to the underworld through one of the gates. Esher stared blankly as the water danced in front of him, and Aiko remained calm behind him, not at all affected by the fact he had just admitted to being older than 600 years. At the time, neither myself nor my brothers could pass through the gates with our powers, because it was safer that no god had power in the mortal realm, as they carried in the underworld.
The underworld is like hell?
She peered over his shoulder, and he glanced at her. The scarlet was emerging in his eyes again, but she didn't seem bothered by it. She was wholly concerned with him, her rich brown eyes echoing her worry. He nodded, but then shrugged. Not hell like you think it. It's a beautiful place. Every soul goes there, good or bad, and they all live in different realms, some nicer than others. She seemed relieved to hear that and went back to washing his shoulders, working her way down to his arms. He tensed when she reached his left wrist and the scars that ringed it, and she knelt and looked up at him, her hand lingering on his forearm. Esher swallowed hard, fought for breath, for his voice, and the will to hold back the tide of pain beginning to surge inside him, one that felt as if it was ripping his every molecule apart. He lifted his eyes to hers and tried to lose himself in them, but the pain grew fiercer. I was friends with the demigod. I had known him for more than a century, and he worked for my father, so we often spent time together. He wanted to stay a little longer in the mortal realm, and I was young and foolish enough to agree. I didn't think anything could go wrong.
But it did,
she gently prompted as his throat closed and he nodded tightly, as memories of that night assaulted him, flickering over the present to brand him with a vision of bloodshed. We were attacked near a village when we were heading to the gate. Humans had seen my friend use powers, only telekinesis, but it had been foolish of him. Humans fear that which they don't understand, and that which is stronger than they are. He spat those words before he could stop himself, anger curling through his veins, heating his blood, and waited for Aiko to look at him differently. But she remained placid and calm, her eyes filled with understanding and not disgust. He looked away from her, back to the water as it drummed on the tray of the shower, focusing on affecting it to stop his mood from affecting the weather, because he was liable to cause a storm that could easily wipe out half of Tokyo. With my powers bound, I wasn't strong enough to fight a mob. There were at least 40 of them, armed with farm tools and some with swords. My friend, he tried to fight, and they hurt him. And I couldn't do anything. His throat closed again, so he cleared it, wanting to hide the depth of his pain from Aiko, even when she could sense it in him. Gods, he wanted to look strong in her eyes, not weak, not like this. He didn't want her to think that he was weak. He gripped his bare knees. When I came around, we were bound, and the humans were angry, vicious as they called us demons, said we were devils and had to die.
Esher,
Aiko started, but he shook his head, telling her not to speak yet. He needed to get it all out, as quickly as possible now, because the storm was building inside him, threatening to tear him apart. They kept yelling it as they tortured him, held my head up and made me watch as they attacked him with pitchforks and daggers, made him bleed and then left him in agony, slumped against the post they had bound him to opposite me. He gritted his teeth and growled. I tried to get free. I tried. But I wasn't strong enough. Gods, I thought I would die there. He looked at her, meant only to glance at her, but lingered when the pain in her eyes, the worry wrapped around him, telling him that she cared for him, that she hated that he had suffered like that. It had been agony, not having his powers when he had grown used to them, when they had always been there when he had needed them. He had been weak without them, practically mortal, and gods, he had hated it. He wasn't like them. He wasn't human. He was a god, but he had been a powerless one. It went on for weeks. His voice hitched, and he released his knees and curled his fingers into tight fists. I kept trying to get free, but whenever I tried, they turned their wrath on me, cut and stabbed me, made me bleed. I tried to use my powers, but nothing happened. I couldn't stop them.
How did you hold on?
Aiko's soft voice offered comfort even as it cut him. He looked down into her eyes. I thought of my family, and that they would come for me. They would find me, and that I had to survive so I could protect them and keep them all safe from harm, from suffering as I had. I had faith in them, and it kept me going, kept me hanging by a thread as the wretched humans murdered my friend. As my own life slipped away, my body battered, mind destroyed, fractured. Fractured, split in two. The male he had once been, and the monster he had become. A monster who was awakened whenever his family were in danger, because he had focused on them in that black time, using them to keep his will to live going, enduring the pain and torture so he could be with those he loved again, vowing over and over again that he would survive so he could protect them.
But they found you?
Aiko rose on her knees and gently cupped his cheeks, keeping his eyes on her. He was sure they were all crimson now, no trace of blue left in them, because he could feel his other side, feel it writhing and whispering to him, telling him to repay the humans in kind and make them bleed, make them suffer, make their loved ones howl in agony. Father was distraught, he murmured, trying to shut down the pain that blazed in his heart before it raged out of control. He couldn't hurt Aiko. He wouldn't risk it. He was stronger than that darker part of himself. He wouldn't lose control. Not while she was holding him like this, anyway, her palm soft against his face, keeping him grounded and with her. He couldn't find me since my powers were bound, and I was practically mortal. So he asked the oracles and then begged Helios to aid him, just as he had aided Demeter in her search for Persephone.
Helios found you?
He nodded. Father was preparing to leave the underworld to free me when the lunar perigee hit. Her brow crinkled. When our moon is closest to Earth, it affects me because of my power. Water. The perigee caused a surge in my powers, enough that they broke whatever restraint the gate had placed on me. He looked away from her, not sure he wanted to see her face when he admitted what he had done. I destroyed everyone at the village, daubed their blood on my face and went on a rampage across the land, devastating everything with storms. Father found me as the moon waned, and it took all of his strength to subdue me and convince me to return to the underworld. Because he had wanted to continue his rampage until there wasn't a single mortal left in the world. He sucked down a slow, deep breath and closed his eyes, and then forced them open again, because he needed to see her reaction to what he was about to say. When the perigee hits, I'm a danger to everyone. My brothers lock me away. When the moon is full, I'm dangerous, and I have to remain within the mansion grounds. If I see my family in danger, those I love, then I'm dangerous. He paused when her eyes widened slightly, and he saw she knew the part of him that he had wanted to hide from her a little longer, the part that was falling in love with her. I'm dangerous, Aiko. I'm fractured. There's a side of me I never want you to see.
But I saw it.
No, he cut her off. You haven't seen it, and you never will, not if I have a say in it. But I don't. Sometimes I can't hold it back. He grabbed her arms and she tensed and gasped. There's a side of me and sometimes I can't stop it. And if I ever change around you, run. As fast as you can, as far as you can. Just run and don't look back, because I don't want to hurt you. And I'm afraid I might. She paled but then rallied, brushed her thumbs across his cheeks and calmly held his gaze as she nodded. Relief poured through him.
Do you hate humans?
She murmured. Yes. No, not all of the time. He pinched the bridge of his nose. Sometimes. A lot of the time. I can't forgive them.
I understand.
She truly did. He could read that in her eyes, feel it in her as she continued to hold his face, her touch offering comfort. She cared for people, strangers, cried over them when they were hurt, and wanted to help them all. He had witnessed that tonight. She had love inside her, love so deep that she had enough for everyone. He only had enough for a few, wasn't sure anyone else deserved his compassion or a single shred of affection from him. She had wept for the dead, had hurt herself by struggling to help them, causing herself emotional pain, but she had done it anyway. She had looked so fragile, so small as she had moved from person to person, battling on, helping as many as she could. She had been so brave. Her strength had amazed him. He would have left them to die, but she had done all she could for them, and would have done more if he hadn't forced her to leave with him. She was stronger than he had thought. His beautiful butterfly. He cupped the nape of her neck, drew her to him as he frowned, and pressed his forehead against hers, a maelstrom of emotions ripping at him, everything from love to rage, from light to darkest black. Gods, he prayed that if she ever witnessed his other side, she would understand, and wouldn't fear him, wouldn't leave him, because he wasn't sure he could live without her. She was light in his dark existence, gave him warmth when he was cold, soothed him when he raged, and gave him strength when he was weak. I never realized humans could be like you, he husked, holding her to him, needing to feel her pressed against him. You give me strength, Aiko, faith, and some belief that I am doing the right thing by protecting the gates between our worlds and the humans. She smiled softly, tipped her chin up, and swept her lips across his, and he tugged her to him and seized her mouth, needed her kiss more than air, more than anything. She didn't fight him. She melted in his arms, even though he was rough with her, was sure he was hurting her. When he had tasted his fill, he convinced himself to release her, and gods, it was a struggle. She rewarded it by rising onto her feet, taking hold of his hand and bringing him onto his. She led him to the pool, and he stepped down into it, sank under the hot water, and let it wash over him, his closeness to his element smoothing the edges off his mood, even as it stung the cuts on his body and the back of his head. He floated in the pool, anxiously listening to Aiko as she washed herself, waiting for her to join him as he studied the faint stars that were giving way to morning as the sun edged towards breaking the horizon. Tokyo would be safe for tonight, the demons not strong enough to withstand the sunlight. He breathed a sigh of relief. The sound of water rippling had him moving onto his knees, and he froze as Aiko stepped down into the pool, naked. He swallowed hard at the sight of her petite curves bared to him, and she looked down, a blush scalding her cheeks that had nothing to do with the temperature of the water as she sank into it, using it to cover herself. His heart pounded. The thought that she trusted him after everything he had told her, was willing to take this next step with him enough to have a shot of adrenaline bursting through his veins. He wasn't sure where to look. He wanted to stare at her, drink his fill of her and make her stand so he could see her clearly, but he didn't want her to feel awkward, embarrassed by being naked around him for the first time. He settled for kicking off and drifting to her side of the pool, and resting beside her on the raised stone that acted like a seat. She glanced across at him, a shimmer of heat in her dark eyes, need that called to him and stoked his own. It had been a long time, a very long time since he had been with someone, and then he had only taken things all the way a few times. After what had happened to him 600 years ago, he had avoided intimacy, partly because he found it hard to trust himself and partly because he feared letting anyone into his heart, afraid of adding another to the small list of those he cared deeply about, and was liable to lose control over if they were injured. But Aiko was already beyond the barrier, held close to his heart, far closer than anyone, and he would never hurt her. Esher? She whispered, her eyes shifting to the Zen garden and then the sky. What's Taiko? He frowned. Diamond must have used it around her, but he didn't remember it. Had he been that far gone? Perhaps she had seen more than a glimpse of his other side after all. It's the opposite of a trigger word. It calms me, helps draw me back and give me control again. He sank back against the smooth stone of the bath, leaning his head on the walkway behind him, and stared at the fading stars. I need you to remember it. It's important, Aiko. If you ever fear me, if I look like I'm... say it to me. He had never thought he would be handing out a safe word to anyone outside of his family, let alone giving it to a human to use on him. But he needed her to have it. He needed her to have some power over him, because he needed to boost his faith that he wouldn't hurt her.
What does it mean?
She moved in the water, and when her arm brushed his, he realized she had been shuffling closer. Her thigh pressed against his, and he couldn't stop himself from lowering his gaze to her legs, and that enticing patch of dark at their apex. His mouth dried out. His cock stirred. He took one of the squares of white cloth from the side behind him and placed it over his groin. It hid nothing from her, only ended up making her look down to see what he was doing. And the pink hue that washed over her cheeks and the flicker of hunger that filled her eyes was enough to have him remembering the way her mouth had felt on his cock, which had it growing as hard as stone. Taiko. He forced the word out, his voice tight, and tried to focus on anything other than the visions of him dragging her into his lap and seating himself inside her, a fantasy that built in his head as he struggled to talk. It's the brightest crater on the moon. He looked for it but couldn't see the damn thing now that he needed something to get her eyes off his aching length. He caught her cheek instead, his hand dripping water all down her, and brought her face up so her eyes met his. The water rolled down her chest to the swell of her breasts, and he struggled not to look at them, painfully aware he could see her nipples clearly just below the surface. Father gave the word to me, because he wanted me to see and remember that even in the darkest times, light can still shine through. Relief went through him when that had her focus settling firmly on his face and his words, not his body. Taiko is that light to me, because I have such a strong connection to the moon, and I've spent centuries reinforcing my bond with it, and that crater, making the power the word has over me stronger. It still only works when I'm partly conscious, when the other me isn't fully in control. Which was the reason Diamond apparently hadn't bothered to spring it on him when the wraith had injured him. Esher couldn't remember much about it, because his other side had been firmly in control. He only knew he had lashed out at his brothers and threatened their females. Gods, if he had wanted to hurt them, could he honestly say he wouldn't hurt Aiko if his other side seized control? He shook that thought away, because contemplating it would only allow fear to take root, and shake his faith that he would never hurt her. Taiko? She murmured the word, and he instantly felt calmer, the way she said it more soothing to him than when Diamond uttered it. I will use it if I have to. But she didn't want to. It doesn't hurt me. He needed her to know that. It just calms me. She half smiled and moved onto her knees beside him, so her breasts crested out of the water, and he had a damned hard time not looking at them. Taiko. She leaned towards him, pressed her right hand to his chest, and scalded him, branding him with her touch as she brought her mouth close to his. That is not going to calm me, just inflame me. He snaked his arm around her waist and hauled her onto his lap as his other hand seized the back of her neck, tangling in her wet black hair. He meant to kiss her, but as he looked at her, all clean now, the dirt of the blast scrubbed from her pale skin, he froze and another need overcame him. He crushed her against him, trembling with the force of it as he held her, clutching her nape and squeezing her tightly. She was fine. Rather than trying to break free of him, she leaned into him, wrapped her arms around his neck and held him. Just held him. It hit him that she needed comfort too, that he wasn't the only one who had been rattled tonight, and she was struggling to cope with the things she had seen, things she had probably never witnessed before. Minutes ticked past and neither of them moved. He absorbed the comfort she gave him, memorized the way she held him and how he could feel her love in that embrace, how much she cared about him, how much she wanted to help him, how much she wanted to be with him. Finally, as the sun broke the horizon, he convinced his grip on her to ease. She drew back, her brown eyes warm and bright, a mixture of love and passion shining in them as she gazed into his. The negative emotions he had felt in her gone now, erased by him holding her, giving her the comfort she needed. He lowered his eyes to her lips, his pulse picking up pace as he stared at their soft curves, and felt her body beneath his hands pressed against him. He could feel her nerves as she trembled slightly in his embrace, could sense her desire as her breath came in shorter, sharper bursts, and her hands settled against his shoulders, and need built in her dark gaze. Need he was going to satisfy for both of them. Chapter 16. Her kiss seared him as fiercely as her touch as he claimed her mouth, trying to keep it tender and gentle, but finding it impossible as she leaned into the kiss and her tongue brushed his lips. Her moan was his undoing, unraveling the ties that bound his passion so it flooded through him, washing away all of his restraint. Esher gathered her closer, crushing her to his chest, needing to feel every inch of her pressed against him. Water rippled around them as he skimmed his hands down her sides, claiming her waist and moved her. As her knees parted, allowing his thighs to press between them, and her backside settled on his knees, her kiss grew tense. He could feel the nerves in her. Was he rushing her? He didn't want to rush her, wanted everything to happen at a pace that she set. He would wait forever if she asked it of him. And when she finally gave herself to him, he would be gentle, tender, everything that she deserved. He would hold back his own need, the searing passion that consumed him, and be careful with her. He would never hurt her. It echoed in his head, a soft chant that filled the silence that stretched between the sound of the water lapping at their bodies, her delicate moans, and his own ragged breathing. When Aiko shuffled closer, her knees coming to press against his hips, he groaned and resisted pulling her closer still, until she brushed his heavy shaft. It throbbed so hard that it hurt, so sensitive that each time the hot water swept over the crown, he had to grit his teeth. As if sensing his need for relief, Aiko lowered her hand, running her fingers over his chest in a maddening way that only made him even more sensitive, had sparks skittering over his flesh and pebbled his nipples. He groaned and tipped his head back as she brushed the head of his cock, damn near wept as she stroked and teased it, sending waves of heat rolling down it, tingles that swept through him and had him verging on begging her for more. "Aiko," he breathed, swallowed hard, and managed to open his eyes and lift his head and look at her. Her brown eyes were dark, pupils dilated in a way that called to him, but it was her beaded nipples that stole his focus. He wrapped his arms around her, hauled her up onto her knees, and latched onto her right one, her moan music to his ears, as her hands instantly came down on his shoulders. She gripped him hard as he suckled and teased her with sweeps of his tongue, tasting the water on her. Her small hands shifted to his hair, tangled in it as she clung to him, clutching him to her. The need to turn up the heat, to tear another passion-drenched sigh from her, had him dropping his left hand and snaking it around her bottom. She tensed and then melted into him, her moan loud in the early morning air, as he found her core and stroked along it towards her bead. It tightened as he brushed it, and gods, he answered her moan with one of his own, as she arched her back, raising her bottom, allowing him easier access. He shook with the need, the hunger building inside him as he explored her with his fingers, stroked them up and down, back and forth between her nub and her entrance, his heart pounding each time he neared it. A desire to press into her had him lingering a little longer each time, judging her reaction as he suckled her nipple. She moaned again as he tugged it a little harder, rolled it in his teeth, and he found the courage he had been missing. He pressed the tip of his finger into her damp core. Gods, it was hot, deliciously warm and wet, tight around his digit as he sank as deep as his first knuckle. She bucked and moaned, gripped his hair so tightly he feared she might pull some out as he withdrew, lowered his hand to her nub and teased it again. His cock fit to burst as a need to be inside her crashed over him. He needed to feel her around him, tight and wet, needed to fill her and make love with her, and make her belong to him. He needed to mark her as his female, needed to make her want only him forever. That need consumed him, A dark desire that was powerful, overwhelming him and driving out all other thought, until only that primal urge to claim her remained. He sank his finger back into her, lifted his head and swallowed her moan in a kiss. He angled his head, pushed past her lips, and tangled his tongue with hers, feasting on her moans as she clung to him, her body trembling with each gentle press of his finger and each withdrawal. Esher couldn't stop himself from adding a second finger and probing her a little deeper, as deep as he could go in the position she was in. It was hard at first, but as he kissed her, touched her, she grew wetter, allowing him to easily slide his fingers in and out. And then she started writhing her hips and seized command of the kiss, her tongue invading his mouth as she drove him back against the side of the bath. Her need flooded him, mingled with his own and made it impossible to deny. On a low growl, he withdrew from her, grabbed her backside in both hands and pulled her to him. She moaned and rocked against his cock as she made contact, sliding up and down on it, filling the air with the sound of water splashing as she frantically rode his length. He lifted her, not breaking the kiss, and angled his hips so he could reach his cock. He shuddered as he pushed the head through her folds, groaned in time with her as he inched into her tight sheath, tensed with her when he hit a barrier. "Aiko," he whispered, clutching her hips, torn between continuing and stopping. Stopping one, because he didn't deserve this. She finally opened her eyes and looked at him, the hunger he could feel in her still shining in them. No flicker of shame lit her features, no embarrassed little blush. There was only the barest hint of anger directed at him. "Don't stop," she murmured and wriggled, and gods, he had to bite down on his tongue to stop himself from doing as she wanted, focusing on the pain rather than the pleasure she unwittingly caused by rotating her hips around the head of his cock. She was making this hard on him. "I want this." Her low, soft voice curled around him, banished the doubts that were creeping in at the edges of his mind to darken it with thoughts that she would regret what they were doing if he took her virginity, that she would hate him for it, because he was a monster. Her eyes met his, no trace of hate in them, no sign that she would come to despise him either, or that she thought him unworthy. "I want this with you, Esher." He wasn't sure how to respond to that. It was too much for him. The darker part hissed that this was a trick, that the human meant to lure him to his doom with her body, pull him into her snare so she could hurt him. Esher shut out the damned voice, because his heart screamed that Aiko wasn't like that. There wasn't a bad bone in her body, and he loved her for it. He loved her for being the one human on this wretched plane who looked at him as if it would kill her to hurt him, as if she would sooner hurt herself than another, as if she loved him. The thought that she was untouched and innocent had the darker side born of his heritage rising to the fore, flooding him with a need to make her belong to him, because she would be his and his alone, and that it was further proof that she was meant to be his, light to his darkness, innocence to his wickedness, but perhaps not too innocent, because she took the decision out of his hands, pressing her body down on his, a look of sheer concentration on her face as she inched him deeper inside her. He groaned and gave up the fight, struggled to focus so he could make it feel good for her, even when he knew it had to hurt. She was tight, small compared with him. It didn't stop her. When she flinched, he gathered her to him, stopping her, and kissed her, distracting her with it as he held her with one hand and teased her nipple with his other one. She was tense for a moment, and then she moaned, and he felt her relaxing, loosening around him as desire built again. He kept kissing and teasing her, dropped his hand to fondle her bundle of nerves, drinking her moans as they grew louder. His own joined them as she moved again, sinking onto him, and he gritted his teeth when she took a sharp breath and pushed down hard, and the tip of his shaft struck as deep as she could take him. He kept kissing her, aware of her pain, and rubbed his thumb across her pert bead, stroking it to ease her and replace the pain with pleasure. Gods, he wanted to move, wanted to lift her off him and sink back into her, but somehow he found the strength to stay where he was, still as a statue, inside her. That sank in, and he drew back and looked at her, found no trace of pain in her eyes, only desire and excitement and affection. He couldn't breathe as he thought about the fact they were one. He was inside her, and she was his now. His forever, if he had his way. His little butterfly. He only hoped she didn't fly away from him. He lifted his hand and cupped her cheek, held her gaze as she leaned into his touch, and felt the weight of that thought press down on him, a fear that wasn't welcome but one he couldn't shut out. She tilted her head, pressed a kiss to his palm that lingered, and then did the one thing guaranteed to make him forget his fears. She moved. Her hands clutched his biceps and she rocked her hips, nothing more than a swirl at first. But then she grew bolder, and gods, he could only watch her as she bloomed before his eyes. He sank against the side of the bath as she began to rock on him, small strokes that barely pulled him an inch out of her, and then 2 and 3. And sweet fucking gods, he wasn't sure he could take it. His breathing turned as ragged as hers as she began to ride him in earnest, making the water lap against his chest as she rose off him almost all the way and then sank back down again. She needed to go higher. He wanted her to feel heaven in his arms, bliss in this moment. Esher caught her hips and she leaned towards him and captured his lips as he started to move her on him, so she almost pulled free of his cock on each stroke. She gasped and shivered, moaned louder as he drove back into her, long slow thrusts that had her breath and his coming quicker. Her arms looped around his neck and she kissed him harder, and he felt the need rising inside her as she began to move again, fighting his control. He pumped his hips each time she sank down on him, driving his cock into her, quickening their tempo as his own need built toward a crescendo. She groaned as he slid lower on the seat, the angle allowing her body to brush his as she came down, and he tore another from her as he sank his hand beneath the water and stroked his thumb across her nub, teasing her in time with his deep strokes of his cock. A soft, startled cry left her lips as she arched backwards, her hands clutching his shoulders, and breasts thrusting into the air. God, she was beautiful as she came undone, her body quivering violently around his length, each jerk and flex of it pushing him closer to the edge. He deepened his thrusts, drank his fill of her as her heat scalded him, and she moaned with each plunge of his cock into her, each stroke that drew out her climax and added to it. She leaned back, the angle making her tighter still, and release surged through him. He tipped his head back, his entire body quaking with the force of it, as he loosed a hoarse shout, his fingers pressing into her soft flesh and pinning her on his cock as it throbbed, pulsing so hard every inch of him kicked with it. He fought for air as he held her there, every muscle tensed as heat and 1,000 stars exploded inside him, and the world drifted away. Aiko sank against his chest, her heart thundering in time with his as she trembled. Gods! He wrapped his arms around her and held her to him, clutched her as she murmured something and settled on him, their bodies still intimately entwined. Time drifted past, the sun rising to bathe the world in gold hues, and when he looked down at Aiko to mention they should leave the bath, he froze. She was sleeping. He carefully scooped her up into his arms, trying not to wake her, and stepped out of the tub. He stared at her as he carried her towards his room, watching over her as she slept, protecting her. He lifted his head and looked off to his left, to Tokyo, where it flickered between the present and the future that would happen if he and his brothers failed. A city broken and blazing against the blackened sky, filled with the terrified shrieks of humans and the wretched snarls of demons. His gaze drifted back down to Aiko. She was dangerous. He knew that. She was a weakness now, one his enemy might exploit to get to him, as they had with Ava for Valen. Valen would have turned to their side for her, just as his brother had said. Esher believed that. He gazed down at Aiko. What would he do for her? He would destroy the world.